Rain tore the Kansas sky open. A man sat motionless on the second bench, soaked through, eyes locked on the empty rails that glowed like twin lines of fire across the prairie. He did not flinch. Water sheeted off his hat and shoulders. The whole town had learned long ago to look away. Why did he return every Friday at the same exact minute? For years, waiting for a train that never brought what he sought. The whistle cut through the storm. Iron wheels screamed on wet steel. Strangers stepped down, heads bowed, and disappeared into the gray. He kept watching the curve, where the tracks vanished behind the hill. Wind rose harder. The platform boards turned black. Then the depot door swung open. A woman stepped out, into the downpour, no coat, no umbrella, walking straight toward the bench. Friday came to Harrow Junction the way it always came. Slow at first, then all at once. The cedar siding of the station had gone the color of ash years ago, and nobody had bothered to paint it since, because paint didn't hold against Kansas wind anyway, and everybody knew it. The rails ran east and west and caught the afternoon sun like two long lines of fire laid flat across the prairie. And when the wind shifted, it carried the smell of coal smoke and hot iron clear down Main Street, past the mercantile, past the feed store, past the church with its bell that hadn't been rung in earnest since the Sunday of the big hailstorm. By 3:30, the platform had already begun to fill. Not with passengers. Not yet. With the particular kind of stillness a small town develops, when it has learned, without deciding to learn it, that something is about to happen, and that nobody is going to speak of it out loud. Because everybody knew what 3:52 meant. At 3:52, a man named Thaddeus Merrow would ride into town on a bay gelding, tie the horse to the post outside the depot, and walk up to the ticket window. He would buy a platform ticket. 5 cents. Exact change every time because he counted it out at home before he left, because a man doesn't like to be seen fumbling for coins in front of people who are trying very hard not to watch him. He would cross the platform. He would sit on the second bench from the east end. And he would wait. Not for anyone who was coming. Everyone in Harrow Junction understood that much, even if nobody had ever said it plainly, not even to each other, not even over coffee, not even in the low voices people use when they're discussing something they've agreed not to discuss. Thaddeus Merrow was 33 years old. He ran 300 head of cattle on land 12 miles south of town. Land his father had broken, and his father's father had died trying to keep. He was not a foolish man. He was not a man given to waiting on things that weren't coming. And yet, 3 years now, 3 years of Fridays, the blacksmith had watched him ride past the forge. So many times he'd stopped looking up from his hammer. The preacher had seen him pass the church steps every week, without ever once turning his head that direction. Mrs. Ottoline Kettleman, who ran the boarding house and kept a closer accounting of the town's business than the bank did, had once remarked to a boarder, over supper, that a man who does the same thing at the same hour every single week for 3 years isn't a mystery anymore. He's a fixture, like the water tower, like the bell that didn't ring. 3 years of the second bench, the exact change. The eastbound arriving at 4:12 and emptying itself of strangers, and Thaddeus Merrow watching every single one of them step down onto the platform with an attention so complete it looked almost like prayer. Then the train would pull away, and he would sit a few minutes more, looking east, toward the place where the rails curved around the hill and disappeared the way all roads disappear eventually, the way all people do too if you wait long enough, which was perhaps the whole point, though nobody in town would have put it that way. Not out loud. Then he'd stand, put his hat on, walk to his horse, ride home. That was the ritual. That had been the ritual for 3 years. And Harrow Junction, being the kind of town that had buried enough of its own to understand the shape of a grief it couldn't see the edges of, had simply let him have it. Nobody asked. This was not because nobody had noticed. A man does not buy a platform ticket every Friday for 3 years, without boarding a train, and go unnoticed in a town of 400 people. It was because the not asking had become itself a kind of kindness. The town had decided somewhere along the way, without a meeting, without a vote, that Thaddeus Merrow's Fridays belonged to Thaddeus Merrow. And that was that, until the rain came, and until a woman who did not yet understand the rules decided she was going to break one. In spring, he came with wildflowers picked along the fence line, indigo and black-eyed Susan, whatever had bloomed on his ride in, never store-bought, never arranged, just gathered loose in one fist, and laid on the bench beside him like an offering nobody, but him could see the shape of. In summer, he came sweat-soaked, from a morning in the saddle, shirt clinging to his back, hat pushed low against a sun that didn't quit till nearly 8. The heat didn't stop him. Nothing had stopped him yet. In fall, he came bundled against a wind that came down off the north, with nothing to slow it for 300 miles, and sat anyway, hands tucked into his coat, breath showing white, watching the same empty stretch of track, with the same unhurried patience he brought to it in June. And in winter, the hardest season for it, the season the whole town privately worried might finally be the one that broke the habit, he came through snow that put the platform boards under 2 inches of white, tracked a single dark path, from the depot door to the second bench, sat there while his own breath froze pale in the air, and waited out the 4:12 same as any other Friday. Because a habit built on love doesn't check the weather before it decides whether to show up. The town watched all 4 seasons of it, twice over, sometimes 3 times, depending how far back you wanted to count. Watched him ride in on Christmas Eve one year, the one Friday out of 52 the depot barely had caused to stay open at all, since the 4:12 ran nearly empty, that week with most folks already home. He came anyway, sat anyway. The station master before Addie, old Purvis, before his retirement, had once remarked that he'd sold Thaddeus Merrow more 5-cent platform tickets than he'd sold to any other living soul in the 11 years he'd run that window, and he said it not as a complaint but as something closer to reverence, the way a man might speak of a comet that came around reliable enough you could set a calendar by it. Nobody in Harrow Junction could have told you, if pressed, exactly when they stopped seeing it as strange and started seeing it as simply true, the way you stop noticing the shape of a mountain you've lived beneath your whole life, until a stranger arrives and asks you what it's called, and you realize you'd forgotten it was ever worth naming. That was the town Adeline Whitfield stepped into, on a gray Tuesday in the last week of February, 3 years and 2 months, after Cora Merrow's fever took her. A town that had built, without meaning to, an entire quiet religion around one man's Fridays. She had no way of knowing, setting her hatbox down in the depot's small back room, that first afternoon, that she was about to become its newest and most unexpected article of faith. To understand what Thaddeus Merrow was doing on that bench, you had to understand what he'd lost, and to understand that, you had to go back further than 3 years. You had to go back 9. He was 24 the day he first saw her. Cordelia Ashworth. Everyone called her Cora except her mother, who called her Cordelia the way some mothers do, like a full name is a leash you can still tug on even after a girl's grown. She'd come off the westbound with too many bags, and not enough hands to carry them, standing on this very platform in a traveling dress the color of a Kansas dusk, arguing quietly with a porter about a trunk that had gotten separated somewhere back in Emporia. Thad had been at the station collecting a shipment of fence wire. He'd set the wire down. He hadn't decided to help her. His feet had simply carried him over before the rest of him had voted on it. She'd thanked him the way people thank you when they don't like needing help and are trying hard not to let it show. Clipped, precise, eye somewhere just past his shoulder. He'd carried her bags the 4 blocks to her aunt's house, and thought about the whole exchange the entire ride home, unable to stop himself, turning it over and over the way a man turns over a coin he's not sure he's allowed to keep. He came back the next Friday, before he even knew whether she'd still be in town. She was, and so, it turned out, was he every Friday after that, for reasons he found harder and harder to explain to himself as anything other than what it plainly was. They married the following spring. His father, dying by then of something the doctor never quite named, lived just long enough to see the wedding, and nod his approval from a chair on the porch, which was, Thad always said afterward, the last thing his father ever gave him that mattered. 2 years into the marriage, Cora's mother took sick down in Salina, a wasting kind of sickness that dragged on slow, the way the worst kinds do. Cora went to nurse her. 14 months, she was gone more than she was home, and every single one of those 14 months, she took the Friday eastbound back to Harrow Junction to spend the weekend with her husband, before returning Sunday evening to her mother's sickbed. This bench, right here. She used to say the train was always late in those days too, and that she could see him from the window before the wheels had even finished rolling to a stop. Said she always knew which bench was his because it was always the same one. When her mother finally passed, Cora came home for good. But the two of them kept coming to the station on Friday afternoons anyway, sitting together and watching other people's trains arrive for no particular reason at all, except, she told him once, that this platform was the place she'd first understood somebody was waiting on her. Nobody had ever waited on her like that before. Not her mother, who'd needed tending more than she'd ever offered it. Not anyone. 3 years of marriage after that. Good years, ordinary years, the kind that don't make for much of a story because nothing goes wrong in them until the fever came in the fall of Cora's 29th year, and took 12 days to finish what it started, and left Thaddeus Marrow standing in a house built for 2 people with only himself left to fill it. He kept coming to the bench anyway, because it was the last place he could still see her running. She always ran the final 20 yards of the platform, said walking was too slow, after 3 hours cooped up on a train. He could see it there, exact as the day it happened, whenever he sat on that bench and looked east. He couldn't always see her at the ranch anymore. The house had gone quiet in a way that made her face go soft at the edges in his memory, like a photograph left too long in a window, fading a little more each season. But here she was still running. That was the whole of it. That was what the town had decided, without ever saying so, was none of its business to interrupt. 12 miles south, the Marrow Ranch carried on, without her too, in its own quieter way. Obadiah Fitch had worked the land, since before Thad was old enough to sit a horse alone. A broad, weathered man well past 50 now, with hands like something carved rather than grown, and a way of saying very little, that somehow always managed to say enough. He'd worked for Thad's father first, then for Thad. He'd been there the morning Thad's father died on the porch. He'd been there 3 years back, the night the fever took Cora, though what exactly happened that night was a thing Obadiah did not discuss, and Thad did not ask him to. Most evenings now, the two of them ate supper together in near silence at the long table in the ranch house kitchen. A kitchen Cora had once organized down to the last spoon, every drawer and shelf holding a logic only she'd fully understood, a logic Thad had never once disturbed since. Obadiah would talk cattle, weather, fence line. Thad would answer in the fewest words that would serve, and afterward he'd sit alone at the desk in the front room doing the ranch accounts by lamplight, the way he'd done them alone for 3 years now, though it had once been a task he and Cora did together after supper, her quick with the numbers in a way he never quite managed to be. He missed the numbers most of all some nights. Not because he couldn't do them, because doing them alone felt like doing them wrong, even when the arithmetic came out exactly right. That was the man who rode into Harrow Junction every Friday afternoon. Not a broken man. A man carrying something whole and heavy and entirely his own, the way some men carry a limp for the rest of their lives, after a fall, not incapacitated by it, just permanently, quietly changed. Her name was Adeline Whitfield, and she had been at the Harrow Junction ticket window for 6 weeks. She had come from Topeka in the last week of February with 1 trunk, 1 hatbox, and a letter of reference from a station master who had described her as capable, exact, and disinclined toward unnecessary conversation, which she had read twice on the train west, and decided was probably meant as a compliment. Because it was true. She was capable. She had spent the last 11 years proving it, first to a father whose lungs had started failing when she was 22, then to a mother who followed him into the same sickness 2 winters later, as though grief itself were catching, as though a marriage of 30 years simply could not survive being cut in half. Her father in January, her mother in March, 14 months apart if you counted from the first bad cough to the last, which Addie did. She counted things. It was perhaps the only thing that had kept her upright through any of it. She remembered the last morning of it exact, the way you remember the worst mornings whether you want to or not. Gray light coming thin through the bedroom curtains. Her mother's hand, small and dry as paper, not gripping hers anymore, just resting there. The way a bird rests on a branch it no longer has the strength to fly from. Addie had sat in the chair by the window 3 straight nights by then, counting her mother's breaths the way she'd once counted her father's, because counting was a thing to do, with her hands, when there was nothing else left that her hands could do. Her mother had opened her eyes once, near the end, and looked at her, not confused, not frightened, just looking, The way you look at something you're trying to memorize on your way out a door you know you won't walk back through. "You'll be all right," her mother had said. Not a question. Not quite a comfort either. More like an instruction Addie hadn't yet worked out how to follow. She hadn't been all right, not for a long while after. But she had learned, in the months that followed, how to look like she was, how to keep a household running, how to answer condolence calls with a steady voice, how to fold grief up small enough to carry in a coat pocket the way some men carried old train tickets, taken out only in private, only when the weight of it demanded looking at. She had stood in the empty house in Topeka afterward, her house now, hers alone, still full of furniture arranged for two people who were no longer in it, and she had understood, in the particular flat way you understand something true and unbearable at the same moment, that she had organized every single year of her adult life around the needs of people who could no longer need anything from her at all. So she sold the house. She took the first position that came open more than 100 miles from anyone who knew her name, because being a stranger, she had decided, was easier than being watched. Watched with that careful tenderness people always seemed to offer the recently orphaned. That tilted head. That softened voice. The one that made her want to walk straight out of a room. She could not have explained to anyone why kindness had become so much harder to bear than plain silence. She only knew it was true, the way she knew most things about herself now, abruptly, and without much use for the knowledge afterward. The train ride out had taken the better part of 2 days, and she had spent most of it looking out the window at land going flatter and emptier by the mile, thinking that flat and empty suited her state of mind exactly. She arrived at Harrow Junction on a gray Tuesday with her trunk, her hatbox, and a headache from the cinders and the outgoing station master, an older man named Purvis, retiring to live with his daughter in Council Grove, walked her through the ledgers, the schedule board, and the small back room with its stove in under an hour and then simply left. As though the whole of it were no more complicated than that. It wasn't, mostly. She sold tickets. She logged arrivals. She kept the schedule board current each morning, wiping the chalk clean with a rag that smelled permanently of coal dust no matter how many times she washed it. She rented a room from Mrs. Kettleman down the street, a tidy, narrow room with a window that looked out over the Kettleman garden gone brown with early spring, and she ate supper each evening at a boarding house table with 4 other lodgers whose names she learned, and whose stories she made a careful point of not asking after, because she had come here to be a stranger, and a stranger she intended to remain. Mrs. Kettleman did not pry. This was, Addie decided within her first week, the single most remarkable thing about the woman, because Adeline Kettleman clearly knew everything there was to know about everyone within 20 miles and simply chose, with the discipline of a woman running a tight boarding house, not to spend that knowledge carelessly. She was somewhere past 60, built solid and short, with hands roughened, from 40 years of bread dough, and a laugh that came rare, but came loud when it finally arrived. She'd buried a husband of her own, back before the war, and had never remarried, and when asked why, which happened rarely because most people in Harrow Junction had learned better, she would only say she'd loved one man enough for one lifetime, and didn't see the arithmetic in trying for 2. She'd taken one look at Addie on that first gray Tuesday, still holding her hatbox in the boarding house hallway, and said only, "You'll want the room at the back. Quietest one. Faces the garden, such as it is this time of year." That had been the whole of the interview. For weeks, the two of them existed in a companionable sort of orbit, supper at 6, a nod of good evening, the occasional remark about weather or the price of flour. Mrs. Kettleman did not ask why a capable young woman had come alone to a town where she knew nobody. Addie did not ask why the older woman kept, on the mantel in the front parlor, a single daguerreotype of a young man in a uniform gone out of fashion 20 years before, dusted every morning, without fail and never once discussed. But one evening in April, Mrs. Kettleman set down her mending in the parlor and looked at Addie, over the top of her spectacles, with the particular directness of a woman who had decided the time for careful orbiting was over. "You've started walking different," she said. Addie looked up from her own sewing. "I beg your pardon? Your walk, coming back from the station these past few Fridays. Used to come in here like a woman finishing a chore. Lately you come in like somebody who's just left the good part of her day behind and is already thinking on getting back to it." Addie felt her face go warm, which was answer enough, and she knew it, and Mrs. Kettleman knew it too, and neither of them said so directly. "He's a good man," Mrs. Kettleman said instead, mild as anything, going back to her mending, as though she hadn't just appended 2 months of careful silence. Thaddeus Marrow knew his mother, God rest her, knew Cora too, a little. Fine girl. Some might say too good for this world, except I never held with that kind of talk. Just means the world didn't deserve her yet, is all. Some people you don't get to keep as long as you'd like. I wasn't aware anyone had told you. Nobody told me anything, dear. I've got eyes, and I've fed half this town supper for 11 years. You'd be amazed what a woman learns watching people eat. She threaded her needle without looking up. I'll only say this once, since it's not my business to say it twice. That man's been carrying something heavy a long while, and carrying it well, which is its own kind of exhausting, in case nobody's mentioned it to you. If you're fixing to set any of it down for him, even just a little, you go on and do it. This town's been waiting 3 years for somebody to try. Addie sat with her needle still a long moment, thread hanging slack in her hand. I don't know that I'm fixing to do anything, she said finally. I only bring him coffee. Mrs. Kettleman looked at her, over the spectacles again, something almost amused in it now, though her voice stayed perfectly level. She said, I made coffee for Everett Kettleman every morning for 9 years, before he finally asked me to marry him. Coffee's never just coffee, dear. Not the kind you make on purpose for somebody you didn't have to make it for. She went back to her mending, and the matter, as far as Mrs. Kettleman was concerned, was closed. But Addie sat along, while after that in the lamplight of the little parlor, turning the older woman's words, over the way she turned, over everything now, carefully from several angles and finding, this time, that she couldn't locate the flaw in them at all. Harrow Junction did not know her story. Harrow Junction did not ask for it. And for 6 weeks that suited her exactly fine. She watched the town's small dramas unfold outside her window instead. A young man proposing to a young woman on the platform in March, badly, dropping the ring twice, before it found her finger, and getting a yes regardless. A drummer arguing with the freight handler over a crate of sewing machine parts that had arrived a full week late. A dog that had adopted the station as its own territory and slept most afternoons under the bench nearest the water tower, until the week it stopped showing up, and Addie understood, without being told what that likely meant, and grieved it privately, the way she'd come to grieve most things now, alone at her window without comment to anyone. And every Friday a man on the second bench. She'd noticed him her very first week, of course. Everyone would have. A grown man, dressed always in his best shirt, arriving well before the 4:12, without ever once buying a ticket that would take him anywhere at all. But it was by her 4th Friday that she found his name in the station ledger, Marrow T. Platform admission, 5 cents, recorded so many times in the same neat clerk's hand, that the entries had begun to run together like a single long sentence written across 3 straight years of pages, the ink fading a little near the bottom of each page and darkening again at the top of the next, as though even the ledger itself had needed to catch its breath. By her 5th week she had started watching for him. Not on purpose. That was the part that unsettled her, if she let herself think about it, which she mostly didn't allow. She would be behind the window balancing the noon accounts, and she would look up at 3:40 for no reason she could name, and feel something in her chest go quiet, and alert all at once, the way a barn animal goes still before weather. And then he would come, through the door at 3:52 exactly, hat in hand, coins already counted out in his palm, and something in her would settle, the way a held breath settles once it's finally let go. She told herself it was only curiosity. Puzzle. The kind of thing a mind starved of company invents to keep itself occupied, through the long, slow hours of a job that mostly consisted of waiting for other people's trains. She was not being honest with herself, but she was at least being consistent about it. He always thanked her for the ticket, always, but not the way a man thanks a woman he sees, the way a man thanks a doorknob for turning. Automatic, reflexive, his eyes somewhere past her shoulder, already out on the platform, already 4 steps ahead of himself, and headed for the bench. She watched him sit. She watched him wait, through the 4:12, watched him study every single passenger who stepped down, a family wrestling 2 trunks and a birdcage, a drummer in a checked suit, a widow dressed head to toe in traveling black, watched that same patient, searching attention move across each stranger's face in turn, and then, without fail, come up empty. Watched him sit a few minutes longer after the platform cleared. Watched him look east, toward the bend in the rails, toward the hill, toward what looked to Addie like nothing at all, though she was beginning to understand it was very much not nothing to him. Then he'd rise, put on his hat, walk to the bay gelding, ride home. For Fridays of this 5. On the 5th it rained. It started a little after 2, a slow gray rain that came down without much conviction at first, and then found its rhythm, the kind of steady Kansas rain that soaks a man through before he's gone a mile and doesn't much care whether he minds. By 3:30 the platform boards had gone dark and slick, and the wind had picked up enough to bend the weeds along the fence line flat against the ground. Addie assumed he wouldn't come. She was wrong. At 3:52, through the rain-streaked window, she watched Thaddeus Merrow ride in exactly on time. His good shirt already soaked, through and clinging to his shoulders, no wildflowers in his hand this week. The rain had beaten him to the fence line, though she had no way of knowing that yet, not the whole shape of it. He tied his horse. He came in dripping, bought his ticket with exact change, water running off the brim of his hat, and pooling on the counter between them, and he thanked her the same automatic way he always did. And then he went out, and sat on the second bench. In the rain, she watched him from the window while she was supposed to be closing out the noon ledger, and she found she could not make the numbers hold still in her mind. Kept losing the count, kept looking up. A grown man, soaked through, sitting still in a downpour, and watching an empty stretch of track, with the stillness of someone at a graveside, and something in her chest cracked open in a way she had not given it permission to do. Because she knew that stillness. She had sat in it herself. At her mother's bedside in March, in a chair pulled up to a window, watching rain come down on a Topeka street, and understanding, with the particular clarity grief brings, and then just as quickly takes away again, that some kinds of waiting have nothing at all to do with hope. That some people sit and watch not because they expect the outcome to change, but because sitting and watching is the last conversation they still know how to have. The 412 came in, through the rain, brakes shrieking wet against wet rail, and its passengers came down hunched under umbrellas, and turned up coat collars, and Thaddeus Merrow watched every one of them anyway. Rain running off his hat brim in a steady line down, onto his shoulders. Watched until the last stranger passed him by. Watched the train pull out. Sat there afterward, looking at wet tracks going nowhere in particular, for his customary few minutes more. And Addie closed the ticket window. She hadn't decided to. That was the strange part of it. Later, when she tried to explain the moment to herself, and couldn't quite manage it. One instant she was behind the glass, with the ledger open in front of her. The next she was standing. The next the door was swinging shut behind her, and the rain was on her face, cold and immediate, and she was crossing the platform toward a man she had exchanged perhaps 40 words, within 5 entire weeks. Which made no sense, except it made every kind of sense. Except she couldn't have said which, because 6 weeks was nothing. 6 weeks was a stranger's schedule memorized out of boredom. And boredom didn't explain why her feet were already moving. And moving didn't explain why her heart was going like she'd run the distance instead of walked it. So she stopped trying to explain it, until she was standing right in front of him, which was, by then, too late to turn back from anyway. She sat down beside him, on the wet bench, in her good work dress which would be ruined by morning, and which she did not, in that particular moment, care about even slightly. He didn't look at her, didn't startle either, just kept his eyes on the empty track, rain running down the line of his jaw and off his chin. "Who are you waiting for?" The question came out of her plainer than she'd meant it to. No question mark in her voice at all, really. No softness. Just the thing itself, laid down flat between them like a card set on a table, face up, no taking it back now. He was quiet a long moment. Too long. She almost stood. Almost apologized. Almost said something about the weather instead. Something small and safe to cover the enormous thing she'd just done. sitting down uninvited on a stranger's grief like it was any old bench. Except she didn't, because she had watched him 5 weeks by then. Long enough to understand that Thaddeus Marrow was not a slow man. He was a careful one. There was a difference. And she knew that difference because her father had been the very same, a man who let silence do its work, before he ever asked words to do it, because words once spoken cannot be called back, and a careful man respects that fact the way other men respect a loaded gun. He reached into his coat, inside pocket, drew out a ticket, not the one he'd bought that day, an old one, paper gone soft and pale at every crease, folded and unfolded so many times, over that the fold lines had worn white and thin as thread, the kind of thing a man doesn't carry as proof of anything to anyone. The kind of thing he carries because his hand needs somewhere to go, some nights when his chest gets too full to hold still on its own. He held it, didn't hand it over. "My wife," he said. 2 words. And the rain kept coming, and Addie sat very still, because she understood, without being told, that this man had never said those 2 words out loud in this town before. Not once. Not in 3 years. And that whatever came next was going to cost him something real to say. Her name was Cora. He turned the old ticket over once in his fingers. Didn't look down at it. Didn't need to. When we first married, she went to nurse her mother over in Salina. 14 months her mother was sick. And every Friday, every single one of them, 14 months straight, Cora took the eastbound home to me. For the weekend. Sundays she'd go back. He looked at the tracks. This bench. Right here. Train was always late in those days too. She used to say she could see me from the window before it even finished rolling to a stop. Said she always knew which bench was mine, because it was always the same one. And after her mother passed? Addie asked. Quiet. Careful with it, the way you set down something that might break if you're not. She came home for good. A pause. Rain on the tin roof of the depot, steady as a pulse. But we kept coming Friday afternoons anyway, sitting right here, watching other people's trains come in, for no reason at all. Except, his voice caught, just barely, a hairline crack through stone. Except she said this was the place she first understood somebody was waiting on her. Nobody'd ever waited on her before. Not like that. Not once. He folded the old ticket back along its worn lines. Put it away. She died 3 years ago. Fever. 12 days start to finish. He looked east. At the bend in the rails. At the hill. I kept coming. Addie sat in the rain beside him and said nothing for a long while, because there was nothing she could say that wouldn't come out sounding smaller than the thing he just handed her. She thought about a woman on a specific bench at a specific hour, week after week, for years, not because she expected a train to bring anyone back, but because some part of the human heart simply needs a place to keep its vigil, and a bench is as good a place as any. Maybe better than most, because a bench at least never asks you to explain yourself. You know she won't be on the train, she said finally. Not cruel, just true. The way you'd say it only to someone you respected too much to lie to. I know. Then why? Another flat statement instead of a question. She noticed it herself even as she said it. Noticed and didn't correct it. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. The rain had eased to a fine mist by then, the kind that doesn't so much fall as hang in the air and settle onto everything at once, slow and patient. Because this is the last place I can remember her running, he said. She always ran the last 20 yards. Said walking was too slow after 3 hours on a train. I can still see it right here exact as the day it happened. Can't always see her at the ranch anymore. House gets quiet, and her face goes... He stopped. Started again. Goes soft at the edges, like a photograph left in a window too long. Fading a little more every season whether I want it to or not. But here, he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The unfinished half of it sat between them, plainer than anything he could have said to complete it. Addie looked out at the empty platform boards, dark and glistening under the last of the rain, and pictured it, without meaning to, a woman running the final stretch toward a man, who had been standing exactly here waiting, for reasons that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with love that hadn't finished arriving, yet when it was cut short. And a man who had spent 3 years coming back to stand inside the shape of that running, because it was the one place left in his whole life where the loss didn't feel like only loss. "I'm sorry," she said, not because it was the expected thing to say, because she meant it entirely, down to the bone in a way that surprised her with its weight. He nodded, didn't speak again. They sat together in the rain, while longer, two people who had each lost, in their own separate winters, someone whose absence had gone, and reorganized the shape of every ordinary day that followed after. Then he put on his hat, walked to his horse, rode home, water sheeting off his shoulders in the fading light, and Addie watched him go, until the rain swallowed him up past the fence line. She went back inside, sat at the ticket window, looked at the chalk schedule board, through wet glass, and thought about a folded paper ticket carried in a coat pocket for 3 straight years, and about the particular kind of faithfulness that required, and about whether she had it in her. That kind. She wasn't sure. She wasn't sure of much that spring. But she thought about it anyway, long after the lamps needed lighting, long after she should have already left for Mrs. Kettleman's supper table. The following Friday, she left a cup of coffee on the second bench, before he arrived. She had made it on the little stove in the back room of the depot, and she had thought about doing it for 4 straight days, before she let herself, turning the idea, over the way she turned, over most things now, carefully from several angles, hunting for the flaw in it before she'd commit to anything. In the end, she decided it was a small thing. And small things, she told herself, either mattered or they didn't. There was no dignified middle ground to hide inside. He arrived at 3:52, saw the coffee sitting there, steam curling up off it, into the cool afternoon air, looked toward the ticket window. She was busy with a passenger just then, an elderly gentleman fussing over a freight receipt he was certain had been miscalculated, and she did not look up. Would not let herself. He sat. He drank the coffee. When the 4:12 had come and gone and he'd sat his customary few minutes after, he carried the empty cup back to the window himself. "Thank you," he said. "It gets cold waiting," she said, eyes on the schedule board, not on him. He held the cup a moment, turning it slightly in his hands, the way a man turns, over a thought he isn't entirely sure he's ready to say aloud. "How'd you know how I take it?" "I guessed." "You guessed right." He left without further comment, and Addie carried the empty cup back to the stove, and stood there a moment, turning that small exchange over in her mind. No sugar. She'd guessed that correctly on the very first try, and she understood, standing there, that she'd guessed right, because she'd been paying far more attention to this man than any 6 weeks of casual observation could reasonably account for. He was not a man who added sweetness to things that didn't need it. She had known that about him before she'd known almost anything else about him at all. The coffee appeared every Friday after that. She didn't sit beside him again right away. She gave him the bench and the coffee and the whole width of the platform between them because some kinds of grief need room before they're ready for company. But she noticed on the 3rd Friday of coffee that he stayed a few minutes longer than usual after the train pulled out. Still looking at the tracks. But differently, she thought. Less like a man keeping vigil. More like a man remembering, which was, she was beginning to understand, not at all the same thing. By the 6th Friday, he'd started bringing the cup back, before she could come collect it, setting it on the counter with a small, deliberate care, like a man returning something borrowed, and not wanting to be seen as careless with it. "You'll spoil me," she told him one afternoon, taking the cup. "Didn't take you for a woman who spoils easy." "I don't. That's what makes it dangerous." He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost, which for Thaddeus Marrow was its own kind of loud. "You always this particular about your coffee?" she asked. "Only coffee I ever trusted was my mother's. And Cora's after. And mine." He considered it, the way he considered most things, slow and unhurried, letting her wait on the answer a beat longer than was strictly comfortable. "Yours is close," he said finally. "Close. Close is a compliment out here. Don't go asking for more than that." I wasn't asking for anything. Weren't you? I was not. Your face says otherwise. My face says nothing of the sort. Your face, he said, and this time the almost smile made it the rest of the way, has been saying otherwise since about the third cup. She opened her mouth to argue, and found, a little to her own annoyance, that she didn't have an argument ready. So she took the empty cup back to the stove instead, chin up, saying nothing further, and if her own mouth had curved somewhat on the way there, well, nobody in the back room was there to see it, but the coffee pot, and the coffee pot, as far as she knew, kept its opinions to itself. It became, after that, a small standing contest between them, some new observations smuggled into the handoff of an empty cup, some dry rejoinder waiting on the other side of it. Nothing large, nothing that would have looked from a distance like anything at all, but Addie found herself, more than once, composing a line for the following Friday days in advance, turning it over the way she turned, over everything, testing it for its weight. And she understood, if she was honest with herself, exactly what that meant about where things were headed, even if neither of them had said so plainly yet. What she did not know, could not have known, watching from behind the glass, was that something had shifted in Thaddeus Marrow 3 days, before that first cup of coffee ever appeared on the bench. Obadiah had come to him at dawn, that Tuesday, with the particular grim quiet of a man bringing news he didn't want to be the one bringing. Storm took down 40 yards of the west fence overnight, Obadiah said. Better part of a dozen head wandered clean off the property, before I caught the break at first light, still rounding up strays. Thad had ridden out himself before the sun was fully up, working the fence line in the mud alongside Obadiah, counting what wandering cattle they could recover the way a man counts anything he spent years building, carefully, and with a grief that gets out ahead of the actual loss, before the loss has even finished arriving. A dozen head against 300. It wasn't ruin, not even close, but it was the kind of morning that reminded a man how thin the margins ran, carrying a ranch alone for 3 years, with no one to split the worry across. He'd carried that worry with him to the station that Friday, carried it onto the second bench, into the 412's arrival, into the empty stretch of track afterward, and the coffee had been sitting there waiting. Hot, made by someone who hadn't been asked and hadn't needed to be. He drank it, and for the first time in 3 years, sitting on that bench with the taste of good coffee, and a long muddy morning still in his shoulders, the tracks going east had not felt like only an absence. They had felt, for just a moment, like a place where he was known. She never told him about her own Fridays. Not the shape of them, anyway. Not the 11 years spent circling her parents' needs like a moon, with no light of its own. Not the 2 funerals 14 months apart. Not the empty Topeka house she'd walked out of, and sold without a backward glance, because staying inside it had felt like agreeing to be haunted for the rest of her life. It wasn't that she was hiding it, exactly. It was only that her version of the same loneliness felt smaller, set beside his. Smaller, and therefore, in the quiet arithmetic she'd been running on her own worth for far longer than she cared to admit, not worth equal weight in the conversation between them. She had spent most of her adult life in a house arranged around other people. Her father's decline had started when she was 22. By the time she turned 33, both her parents were gone, and she had stood in the rooms they'd left behind and understood with a clarity that felt almost cruel in its plainness, that she had organized every single year of her grown life around the needs of people who could no longer need a single thing from her ever again. So she'd sold the house, taken the first position more than 100 miles from anyone who'd ever called her by name. Every Friday now she sold tickets to people bound for somewhere else, watched them climb aboard trains headed toward futures she wasn't any part of, then walked back to her room at Mrs. Kettleman's and ate supper alone at a table set, in her mind at least, for one. She knew, perfectly capable of doing this indefinitely. She had proven her own capability so many times over the last 11 years that she'd long since stopped needing anyone else to confirm it for her. But capability, she was starting to understand, was not the same thing as sufficiency. One evening in early April, walking back from the depot, with the wind cutting hard off the open plain and working its way through every seam of her coat, She stopped on the boardwalk outside the mercantile and simply stood there. Looked down Main Street at the town going about its business in the fading light. Harrow Junction was a cattle town in the middle of becoming something else. The big open range drives were ending, everyone said so, and barbed wire and wheat were reshaping the whole country faster than most of the old ranchers wanted to admit out loud. The feed store had a new sign up. The hotel had fresh paint on its trim. Life was proceeding all around her at its own steady clip, and she was proceeding alongside it, not part of it. She walked on to Mrs. Kettleman's, ate her supper, went up to her room and sat by the window a while the way she always did and thought, not for the first time, though with more force than usual, that she was 33 years old, and she had a bench and a man who came to sit on it every Friday, and for the first time since her parents died, she had something on Friday afternoons that she actually looked forward to. That frightened her. It mattered to her too at exactly the same moment in exactly the same breath, and she went to sleep that night without resolving the contradiction, because some contradictions don't resolve. They just sit inside you, quiet, and wait to be lived through instead. It happened again in November. Not because of rain this time. Simply because one Friday Thad arrived and sat, and Addie, who had finished her window work early for once, carried 2 cups out and sat down beside him without ceremony, without asking, the way you'd sit beside someone you'd already, somewhere along the way, decided you trusted. He didn't tell her to go back inside. They watched the eastbound come in together. 3 passengers stepped down. That Friday, a drummer. A young couple newly married by the look of their traveling clothes. An old woman guarding a birdcage like it was buried treasure. Thad watched each one, with that same unhurried, searching attention he gave every arrival, out of habit now, as much as hope, Addie was beginning to think. Then the train pulled out and he looked at the tracks, and she looked at them too. Beside him, smoke from the departing locomotive hanging low, and blew over the cold platform. She was 26 when I met her, he said. Right here. 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 A faint change came over his face, not quite a smile, not yet, but the country a smile comes, from before it arrives. Had too many bags for one platform. I helped her with them and she thanked me the way somebody thanks you when they don't like needing help and they're trying hard not to let it show. He looked at the tracks. Thought about that the whole ride home. Couldn't stop thinking about it, matter of fact. Did you come back the next Friday? Before I even knew if she'd still be in town. Addie held her cup with both hands, letting the warmth of it settle into her fingers. The platform smelled of coal smoke and cold iron. The afternoon was clear and sharp the way November afternoons get in Kansas, when the sky goes a hard bright blue and every sound seems to carry twice as far as it should. Did she know, Addie asked, that you kept coming before she did? He almost smiled then, properly. Slow, the way his smiles seemed to arrive, like something climbing a long hill before it finally reaches the top. Told me once the most frightening thing about me was that I was the kind of man who showed up without any guarantee. He was quiet a moment. Said she'd never had anybody do that for her before. Not once in her whole life. Addie looked at the tracks and said nothing for a while, because she was thinking about her own life, 33 years of it, built entirely around other people's needs, with almost none of it ever spent showing up for a mere possibility, because the odds had always seemed too low to justify the risk. And then she looked at Thaddeus Marrow, really looked at him, and saw something in him she had been choosing very deliberately not to see for 8 full months. A man sitting on a cold bench, because a woman had once run the last 20 yards of a platform to reach him. And because coming back to the place where that had happened was still, 3 years on, the most honest thing he knew how to do with a Friday afternoon. They sat together as the light went gold, and then gray, quiet in the particular way of 2 people thinking the same thought, without ever having agreed to think it out loud. By the time the cottonwoods along the creek had gone bare, and the first hard frost had silvered the pastures, there was no pretending anymore that the whole town hadn't noticed. It happened the way these things always happened in a place the size of Harrow Junction, not through any one dramatic revelation, but through a slow accumulation of small sightings, each one passed along at the mercantile counter, or over a fence rail, or across the aisle at Sunday service, until the accumulated weight of them became, without anyone quite deciding it should, common knowledge. Mrs. Abernathy at the Mercantile had seen them walking, as far as the corner of 3rd Street one Friday evening, not touching, just walking, but walking slow, in the particular unhurried way of two people in no rush to arrive anywhere. The blacksmith's wife had noticed that Thaddeus Merrow's horse had taken to standing at the post outside the depot a good deal longer than it used to, well past the 4:12, sometimes clear past 5. And Reverend Ashby, who missed very little from his post at the church steps, remarked to his wife, over supper, that the man's shoulders looked different lately. Straighter, somehow, like a fellow who'd set something down he'd been carrying a long while. None of it was scandalous, and everyone in town seemed to understand that instinctively, the same instinct that had kept them from asking Thad about his Fridays in the first place. Whatever was happening on that platform bench belonged to the two people sitting on it, same as the grief had, and the town extended the same careful courtesy to this new, tentative thing that it had extended to the old familiar sorrow. Which was to say, it noticed everything and commented on nothing. Not to their faces, anyway. Behind their backs was, naturally, a different matter. "She's good for him," Mrs. Kettleman announced to her supper table one evening, apropos of nothing, setting down a bowl of potatoes, with the finality of a woman closing an argument nobody present had actually been having. "Anybody with eyes can see it. Man's been sleepwalking through his own life 3 years, and here she comes along and wakes him up a little, week by week, patient as you like. That's not scandal. That's mercy." One of the other lodgers, a young drummer named Elkins, who boarded there between routes, allowed as how he'd heard talk, that Merrow hadn't so much as looked at another woman since his wife passed, and wasn't it something, the way Miss Whitfield had managed it, without seeming to try at all. "That's exactly how it's managed, when it's managed right," Mrs. Kettleman said, in the tone of a woman who considered the subject closed to further discussion, and passed the potatoes. Addie, for her part, heard almost none of this directly. Small towns are considerate enough to conduct their gossip mostly out of earshot of its subjects, but she felt the shift in how people looked at her all the same. The way Mrs. Abernathy's greeting at the Mercantile had warmed by several degrees over the autumn, no longer the polite neutrality extended to strangers, but something with actual welcome in it. The way the Reverend's wife had started saving her a seat at the church social, angling it, without comment, close enough to where Thad usually stood at the edge of things, with his hat in his hands. She didn't know quite what to do with any of it. Being watched had always frightened her more than being alone. That particular tenderness people extended to the recently orphaned had chased her 100 miles, from Topeka, after all. But this was a different kind of watching she was slowly coming to understand. Not pity. Something closer to hope, held carefully on her behalf by people who had, in their own quiet way, decided they wanted good things to happen to both her and the man on the second bench, and were willing to wait and watch for it without pushing, the same patient way the whole town had waited 3 years for something, anything, to finally sit down beside him. She mentioned none of it to Thad. He mentioned none of it to her. But on the last Friday of November, walking the 4 blocks, from the depot toward 3rd Street, with the early winter dark coming down fast around them, he stopped under the gas lamp outside the Mercantile, and looked at her for a long moment, the way he'd once looked at every stranger stepping down off a train, searching, except now, she understood, he wasn't searching for anything he'd lost. "Town's talking," he said. "Not a question. I expect it is. Bother you?" She thought about it honestly, turning it over before she answered. "No," she said finally, and found, a little to her own surprise, that it was entirely true. "I don't believe it does." He nodded, slow, and something in his shoulders eased, that she hadn't quite noticed was tense, until it wasn't anymore. "Good," he said. "Wasn't sure how to feel about it myself. Man goes 3 years being the town's quiet sadness, and all of a sudden he's the town's." He stopped, searching for the word, and gave up on finding it. "Whatever this is," Addie offered. "Whatever this is," he agreed. And for the first time in 8 months, standing under a gas lamp, with the cold coming down, and her breath showing white in the air, Addie let herself smile at him, without immediately looking away. He didn't look away either. Cornelius Drummond came to Harrow Junction for the first time on the 2nd Friday of December, and he came, as men like him always seemed to, wearing a coat too fine for the weather, and a smile too wide for the news he was carrying. He found Thad on the platform, sitting where he always sat, and settled himself onto the far end of the second bench, as though he'd been invited, which he had not. He introduced himself as a man of business out of Topeka, banking mostly, though he preferred the word investment, which he pronounced the way some men pronounce a fine cigar, rolling the syllables around a while before he let them go. "Fine little town you've got here, Mr. Merrow," he said, looking not at the town, but at the rails. "Fine little station. Shame about its future, though." Thad said nothing. Waited. He had learned a long time ago that men who announce their business slowly are usually men whose business doesn't hold up well to being asked about directly. "There's a spur line coming," Drummond went on. "Cattle traffic's grown too heavy for this old depot to keep carrying much longer. The Santa Fe's planning a new loading yard 8 miles east, closer to the county line, better grade for the stock cars. Once that goes in," he gestured, almost fondly, at the gray cedar siding, the worn platform boards, the second bench itself, "well, this little station won't need to stay open. Not for passenger traffic anyhow. Maybe not at all in time." "That's so." "It is." Drummond folded his hands over his knee, unhurried. "A man well practiced at delivering hard news, as though it were a kindness he was doing you. Which brings me to your land, Mr. Merrow. 300 head, 12 miles south, if I'm informed correctly. Good grazing, good water. Sits square in the likely path of where that spur's going to run, or near enough to it that the railroad's going to want a piece one way or another sooner or later. I'd rather you sold it to me at a fair price now than had the railroad come take a strip of it later at whatever price a judge decides is fair." Thad looked east, at the bend in the rails, at the hill. "This bench isn't for sale. Quiet. Final. Nobody's asking for the bench, Mr. Merrow." Drummond smiled, and there was nothing outright unkind in it, which somehow made the whole thing worse. Yet he rose, straightened his fine coat against the cold, and touched the brim of his hat toward the ticket window, where Addie stood watching through the glass, close enough to have heard every word of it carried clear on the still December air. "Miss," he said with a courtesy, so smooth it barely counted as one, and then he was gone, down the platform steps and off toward wherever men like that went once they'd finished planting something they fully intended to come back and harvest later. Thad sat a long while after that, looking at the tracks. Looking, Addie thought, watching him from the window, at something considerably larger than an empty stretch of rail. She came out, sat beside him, the way she'd learned to now, without asking permission for it anymore. "Is it true?" she asked. "About the spur line?" "Don't know yet." His jaw had gone tight. "But men like that don't come around asking questions they don't already know the answers to." She looked at the second bench beneath them, the gray, worn cedar, smoothed soft by 3 years of a grieving man's Fridays, by a woman's coffee, by whatever it was the two of them had quietly begun building on top of an old, unhealed loss. She thought about a folded ticket carried in a coat pocket, about a place a man could still see his wife running, 3 years gone or 20, it hardly seemed to matter which, because grief did not keep a calendar the way the rest of the world insisted on doing. And she understood, sitting there in the falling December light, that whatever was coming next was not going to be gentle, that the town's long, careful kindness, the not asking, the not watching, the letting a grieving man have his Fridays in peace, was about to be tested by something that did not care one bit for any of it. Because money never did. Because men like Drummond built whole careers on the specific fact that it didn't. Thaddeus Merrow put his hat on, walked to his horse. But before he rode, he turned back once and looked at her, really looked, the way he'd looked at every stranger stepping off every train for 3 straight years, except this time the searching in his face had found something, and stopped there. "Thank you," he said, "for the coffee, for all of it." Then he rode south toward a ranch that might not be his much longer, and Addie stood on the platform in the cold and watched him go. He rode the 12 miles home in the last gray light of the afternoon, Drummond's words circling in his head the whole way, refusing to settle into any order he could make peace with. Good grazing, good water, sits square in the path. A fair price now or a judge's price later. He knew enough about men like that to know the second half of the sentence wasn't exactly a threat. It was a fact, delivered politely the way undertakers deliver facts. Obadiah was waiting on the porch when he rode in, a lamp already lit in the front window, and one look at Thad's face told him plainly enough that whatever had happened in town, it hadn't been good. Bad news? Obadiah asked, taking the gelding's reins without being asked, the way he'd done 10,000 times before. Man from Topeka, Thad said, swinging down. Says there's a spur line coming. Says our land sits in its path. Obadiah was quiet a moment, working the horse's bridle loose, with hands that had done the same motion. So many years they no longer needed watching to get it right. Believe him? Don't know yet. Thad pulled off his hat, ran a hand back, through his hair. But he didn't look like a man in the habit of riding out to towns this size to talk about things that weren't happening. They walked the horse toward the barn together in silence, the way they did most things now, two men who'd worked out, over 3 years exactly how much conversation a given task required, and rarely spent a word more than that. But inside the barn, with the gelding settled, and the lamp hung on its hook, Obadiah stopped and looked at him directly, which he didn't do often. Your daddy near lost this place twice, he said. Once to drought back in 74. Once to a fool notion of his own. Tried expanding the herd past what the land could carry, near ran us into the ground before he came to his senses. Both times, folks around here figured the marrows were finished. He picked a piece of straw off his sleeve, considering it like it required his full attention. Both times your daddy sat right there at that kitchen table and did the numbers till he found a way through 'em. Wasn't luck got you through. Was stubbornness. That's a family trait far as I can tell, and you got a full share of it. This isn't drought, Obadiah. Isn't a bad decision I can just undo. It's a railroad and a bank, and a man in a fine coat who's already decided how this ends. Man in a fine coat's decided a lot of things in his life, I expect. Doesn't mean he's right about all of them. Obadiah picked up the lamp, started toward the house. You worry on it tonight if you have to, but don't you go making up your mind about how this turns out before anybody's forced you to. That's your daddy's other trait, and it's not one I'd recommend you keep. They ate supper in the kitchen, same as always, the space between them companionable rather than empty for once, though the weight of what Thad was carrying sat plain enough at the table, that even Obadiah's usual talk of cattle and weather came slower than usual, more careful, like a man picking his way across ice he wasn't entirely sure would hold. It was well into the meal before Obadiah spoke again, and when he did, his eyes stayed on his plate. That Whitfield girl, he said. The one at the station. Thad looked up. Heard some talk in town. Obadiah went on, still not looking up himself, which was, Thad had learned over the years, exactly how the man handled anything that mattered enough to make him careful. Nothing unkind. Just talk. Man your age, sitting a bench 3 years running. Folks notice when something changes. It isn't anything, Thad said, too quick, and heard how it sounded the moment it left him. Obadiah allowed himself something close to a smile, brief and dry. Didn't say it was, just said folks noticed. He finally looked up. For what it's worth, and I know you didn't ask me, I think your Cora would have liked her. Had the same kind of quiet steadiness to her. Same way of paying attention to a person instead of just talking at him. Thad said nothing for a long moment, turning his fork over without eating. I think about that, he admitted finally, more than I let on. Whether it'd be some kind of betrayal, letting anything in. Your Cora ran the last 20 yards of that platform every single Friday for 3 years, straight into a man who was standing there waiting on her, without any promise she'd come, Obadiah said. Woman like that didn't love you, so she could watch you sit alone the rest of your natural life. I didn't know her, but the little I did, and even I know that much. He said it plain, without softness, the way he said most things, and it landed in Thad's chest with a weight that took him a moment to absorb. Besides, Obadiah added, standing to clear his plate, something almost gruff and fond in it now. Man's got enough on his plate fighting off a fella in a fine coat. Might as well have somebody worth fighting for, while he's at it. He carried the dishes to the basin and said nothing further, and Thad sat alone at the table while after, in the quiet Cora had once filled, and Obadiah now shared in his own sparing way, thinking about a spur line that might come and a bench that might not survive it, and a woman who'd started leaving coffee for him before he'd ever asked her to. He thought, too, about his father, a stubborn man who'd sat at this same table twice in his life, and found a way, through ruin that should have ended him. And he thought that maybe stubbornness, applied carefully enough, wasn't only good for saving land. Maybe, applied carefully enough, it was good for a few other things too. 12 miles north, in a narrow room, with a window facing a garden gone brown for winter, Addie sat by her own lamp while longer than usual that night, thinking about a man in a fine coat who had touched his hat to her like it barely counted as courtesy, and about the way Thad's jaw had gone tight when he spoke of it, and about a town that had spent 3 careful years learning not to interfere in a man's grief, now bracing itself, without quite knowing how yet, to interfere in something else entirely. She understood, sitting there, that whatever came next in Harrow Junction was going to arrive the way most important things did. Quietly at first, and then all at once. January came in hard and stayed that way. The kind of cold that got into a house, through the seams, and sat there no matter how high the stove was built up. The kind that turned the horse troughs to ice by dawn, and kept them that way till nearly noon. Harrow Junction hunkered down the way prairie towns always did in deep winter. Shutters latched, chimneys smoking steady all day, the streets gone quiet except for the necessary business of staying alive through it. And every Friday, same as always, Thaddeus Merrow rode in at 3:52. Because some things didn't check the calendar before they decided whether to continue. Because a habit built on love, and now built on something newer besides, didn't much care what the thermometer read. He came through snow that squeaked underfoot, with the cold breath showing white, coat collar turned up against a wind that came down off the north with nothing to slow it for 300 miles. He bought his ticket. He sat on the second bench. And more often than not now, Addie came out and sat beside him before the 4:12 even arrived, 2 cups of coffee steaming between them, her own coat wrapped tight, both of them watching the empty track together like it was the most natural thing in the world for 2 people to do, with a Friday afternoon in the dead of a Kansas winter. It was, by then, natural. That was the frightening part, if Addie let herself think about it, how quickly a thing could go, from strange to necessary, the way frostbite crept in, so gradual you didn't feel the danger of it till the damage was already done. Except this wasn't damage. That was the other frightening part. This was the opposite of damage, and she didn't have the first idea what to do with something that felt that good and that dangerous at exactly the same time. She hadn't let herself think about it too hard. Not yet. But underneath the coffee, underneath the small standing contest of dry remarks traded, over an empty cup, underneath 4 months now of Fridays, that had somehow become the axis the rest of her week turned on, underneath all of it sat a single unmoving fact, that neither of them spoke aloud, because speaking it aloud would have made it real in a way neither of them was ready for. Cornelius Drummond had not gone away. He had simply gone quiet, which Thad had come to understand over the weeks since December was very much not the same thing. The first week of January, the 2 of them fell into a new small ritual neither had planned. Addie had taken to bringing a second thermos now, not just coffee but broth thick with barley, because the cold that January was the kind that settled into a man's bones no matter how good his coat was, and she'd decided, without asking his opinion on the matter, that Thaddeus Merrow was going to eat something warm on Fridays whether he thought he needed it or not. He noticed the second thermos the very first week. "What's this? Broth. Didn't ask for broth." "I know. I made it anyway." Man could take offense at that, being fed like he can't feed himself. Man could. She poured it into the tin cup without waiting on his permission. "This one won't. Drink it before it goes cold." He drank it, didn't argue further. And the following Friday, when she brought the thermos out again, he was already holding the empty cup out toward her, before she'd even reached the bench, which told her everything the words between them hadn't quite gotten around to saying yet. It was Mrs. Kettleman's idea, in the end, the way most decisive things in Harrow Junction eventually turned out to be. "You'll come to Sunday supper," she informed Thad directly, cornering him one January afternoon at the Mercantile, with the particular immovability of a woman, who considered the matter already settled, and the invitation itself merely a formality. "Been feeding that girl 6 days a week for the better part of a year. Seems only right the 7th includes the man she spends every remaining day thinking about." "Ma'am, I don't believe I said anything about—" "You didn't have to say anything, Mr. Marrow. I've got eyes." She softened, just slightly, something almost fond working, into her stern expression. "Sunday, 6 o'clock. Don't be late and don't bring flowers, because Lord knows you've already used up a lifetime's worth of those on a bench. That isn't mine to compete with." He came. The boarding house table sat 6 that particular Sunday, Mrs. Kettleman at the head, Addie across from Thad in a dress the color of good wheat, the drummer Elkins passing, through again on his usual circuit, and 2 elderly sisters, who boarded there permanently, and conducted most conversations as a matched set, finishing each other's sentences, with the ease of people who'd shared a house for 40 years. "So you're the one," the elder sister said to Thad, over the pass of the potatoes, in the tone of a woman confirming a rumor she'd been nursing for months. "Ma'am, the one from the bench. We've heard about you for the better part of a year, haven't we, Cordelia?" She paused, catching herself. "Cornelia, my apologies. Force of habit, calling everybody by my sister's name." "It happens," the younger sister confirmed placidly. "She's called the cat by my name twice this winter." Addie, across the table, had gone faintly pink, and Thad, watching her try very hard to look interested in her potatoes instead of meeting anyone's eye, found himself, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, fighting down an actual laugh. "I've heard a fair bit about all of you too," he offered, "though considerably less specific than what you seem to have on me." "That's because Ottoline runs a discreet table," the elder sister said. "Mostly, entirely," Mrs. Kettleman corrected, passing the bread with the air of a woman who considered the matter closed. Supper went on that way a good while, easy, warm, full of the particular comfortable noise of a table, where everyone had long since stopped performing politeness for each other, and simply enjoyed the company instead. Elkins told a long, improbable story about a mule that had derailed an entire freight schedule in Newton the previous spring. The sisters argued gently about whether it had, in fact, been Newton or Florence, neither willing to concede the point. Mrs. Kettleman presided over all of it, with the satisfied air of a woman watching a plan come together exactly as she'd intended. It was only near the end of the meal, over pie, that the conversation turned, inevitably, toward the thing everyone at that table had been carefully not asking about all evening. "Heard talk of trouble out at your place," Elkins said, not unkindly, the casual bluntness of a man who spent most of his life among strangers and hadn't quite learned Harrow Junction's careful rules about which subjects got raised at supper and which got left for the porch after. "Bank business. Sickness in the herd." The table went quiet just slightly. Addie's eyes found Thad's, a silent question in them. "Do you want to talk about this here, now?" And he held her gaze a moment before answering, something in the steadiness of her attention giving him, he realized, exactly the room he needed to say it plain rather than deflect it. "Both true," he said. "Bank's called an old note. Cattle's been sick since December. Neither one's settled yet, but neither one has me beat either." "Man's got good neighbors," Mrs. Kettleman said, firm, cutting off whatever polite hesitation might have followed. "This town looks after its own. Always has." "It has," Thad agreed, and found, saying it, that he meant it more plainly than he'd have managed even a few months before 40 head of cattle, and a flooded creek confessed at midnight, and neighbors showing up unasked, with buckets in both hands, had taught him, all in the same hard winter, exactly how much a man could still be given even after he'd stopped expecting to be given anything at all. Walking Addie the 4 blocks back toward the depot afterward, an unnecessary walk, since her room sat directly above the very table they'd just left, but neither of them mentioned that particular fact, the cold bit sharp and clean, stars coming out hard, and closed the way they only did on the clearest prairie nights. "They liked you," Addie said, Or they liked embarrassing you. Difficult to say which exactly. Both likely. She smiled, small, private, tucking her hands deeper into her coat sleeves against the cold. Thank you for coming. Wasn't given much choice in the matter. No, she agreed. You weren't. Autoline doesn't extend invitations so much as issue verdicts. I'm beginning to understand that. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, breath showing white between them, and at the depot steps he paused, looking down at her with something unguarded in his face that hadn't quite been there before that evening. Not grief, not worry over the bank or the herd, but something plainer and warmer that neither of them named out loud. Not yet, though both of them felt the shape of it standing there in the cold. Good night, Addie. Good night, Thad. Neither of them moved to go inside right away. But eventually the cold won out over whatever else was keeping them standing there, and he touched his hat and turned toward his horse, and she watched him go the way she'd watched him go every Friday for months now, except this particular Sunday. She found herself smiling the whole walk back up to her room. He found out how not quiet Drummond's silence really was on the second Tuesday of February, when a letter arrived from the Harrow County Agricultural Bank, the bank that had, until that letter, been nothing more to Thad than a building on Main Street he rode past twice a month to make a deposit. He hadn't known, until he opened the envelope at his own kitchen table by lamplight, that the bank had a new principal shareholder, as of the previous autumn. A man out of Topeka. A man with an interest, the letter noted with a formality that felt almost cruel in its politeness, in matters concerning certain outstanding notes secured against ranch properties in the county. Thad read it twice, before the weight of it settled all the way through him. His father's note, the one taken out in the drought year of '74, when the grass had burned to nothing by August, and the only thing standing between the Marrow Ranch and total ruin had been a loan against the land itself, signed in his father's careful hand, paid down slow and steady in the years since but never quite paid off, the last stubborn debt of a man who'd hated owing anybody anything, and who died, with just enough of it still outstanding to leave his son carrying the tail end of it. A manageable sum against 300 head of cattle, a debt Thad had never once lost sleep over. Until now, until the bank that held it had a new principal shareholder named Cornelius Drummond. He rode into town the next morning before his usual Friday to see the bank manager directly, a mild, apologetic man named Whitcomb who'd handled the Marrow account for a dozen years, and looked, when Thad came through the door, like a man bracing for a conversation he'd been dreading since the autumn. I want to know what's changed, Thad said, no preamble, setting the letter on Whitcomb's desk. Whitcomb didn't pick it up. Didn't need to. He'd clearly read it or one just like it a great many times already that month. Mr. Drummond bought a controlling interest in the bank in October, he said. Quiet purchase. Legal, far as I can tell, though I'll admit I didn't love the terms of it. He's within his rights to call outstanding notes, provided he gives proper notice. 60 days is proper notice. I'm sorry, Thad. I truly am. Your father was a good customer of this bank a long while. Is there anything to be done? Pay the note in full, or sign over collateral equal to its value. Those are the only two doors this kind of letter opens, and I expect you already know that, or you wouldn't be standing here looking the way you're looking. And if I can't do either inside 60 days? Whitcomb was quiet a moment, and something in his face made the answer plain, before he said it out loud. Then the bank forecloses on the note's collateral, which is your land, Thad. All of it, technically, though I'd guess Mr. Drummond has a particular section in mind, given the survey crews I've heard tell about along your eastern boundary. Thad rode home that morning with the cold biting through his coat, and the whole shape of it settling into him, not a threat anymore, not a possibility to be worried over in some distant future, but a door with a date stamped on it, closing whether he found his way through it or not. The cattle sickness found the rest of the herd in February. It came the way these things always came, slow at first, and then all at once, a cough here, a lowered head there, easy enough to write off as ordinary winter misery, until the pattern showed itself plain, and there was no writing it off any longer. Obadiah found 6 more head down in the north pasture on the same cold gray morning Thad rode out to check the fence line. Drummond's spur survey crew had been pacing off along the eastern boundary, orange flags planted in the frozen ground like a row of small, patient threats. By the second week, the count stood at 31. They worked from before dawn most days. After that, the two of them moving the healthy stock as far from the sick as the pasture would allow, doctoring what could be doctored, burying what couldn't. It was brutal, unglamorous work, the kind that didn't leave much room in a man's chest for anything but the arithmetic directly in front of him. There was one cow, a old, patient red-brown thing Cora had once named Buttercup for no reason either of them could ever explain, half sentiment and half a joke, that had simply stuck, that Thad had kept on past her useful years because his wife had liked her, had fed her apple cores from her own hand every autumn, had once laughed so hard at the animal's stubborn refusal to be herded anywhere she didn't personally want to go, that Thad had fallen a little more in love with her on the spot, watching. Buttercup went down on a Tuesday in the middle of February. Thad found her himself in the gray hour before full light, already past what doctoring could do, and he stood over her along, while in the cold before he called for Obadiah, his breath coming ragged in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. She was Cora's, he said when Obadiah reached him. Just that. He didn't need to say more, and Obadiah didn't ask him to. They buried her at the edge of the north pasture, under a cottonwood bare of leaves, and Thad stood there afterward, with his hat in his hands a good deal longer than the task required, and Obadiah stood beside him and let him. Wasn't just a cow, Thad said finally. No, Obadiah agreed. Wasn't. Feels like losing a piece of her all over again, which doesn't make any sense. It's an animal, Obadiah. It's not. Grief doesn't ask permission to make sense, Obadiah said. Never has. You lose the woman, and for a good while after, everything that ever touched her hand becomes another way of losing her too. Cow, kitchen spoon, garden fence. Every last thing she ever laughed at, or named or fed by hand turns into one more little funeral you didn't know you were signing up for. Thad looked at him, something raw in his face. How do you know that? Because I buried a wife of my own 30 years back, before you were old enough to remember it, Obadiah said, quiet, matter-of-fact, a piece of his own history Thad had somehow never once heard in 3 years of working beside the man. Lost her and a baby both, same week, back in Missouri before I ever came out this way. Took me the better part of a decade before I could look at a hen without thinking of the ones she used to keep. So I know exactly what standing over a cow like this does to a man. Better than most. Thad said nothing, only reached out after a moment and set a hand on the older man's shoulder. The same gesture Obadiah had offered him weeks before over the bank letter, returned now weight for weight. They rode back to the house together in silence, and it was, Thad thought later, the kind of silence that did more work between two grieving men than most conversations ever managed. Word of the sickness moved, through the county the way word always moved, through a place that's small, not fast, exactly but thorough, carried along fence lines and church pews, and the counter at the mercantile, until there wasn't a rancher within 15 miles who didn't know the Marrow herd was in trouble. Nobody made a show of it. That wasn't how Harrow Junction did things. Same as nobody had ever made a show of Thad's Fridays. But on a Thursday morning in late February, Thad rode out to the north pasture expecting the usual grim work of the day, and found 3 of his neighbors already there ahead of him, Del Whitmore from the churchland, Old Man Corwin from the spread 2 sections over, and a quiet, sturdy widow named Prudence Hale, who ran 40 head of her own on the strength of stubbornness alone, and had lost a husband to the same kind of winter. That was now testing Thad. Didn't send for you, Thad said, swinging down, more startled than he let show. Didn't need sending for, Corwin said, already moving toward the sick pen, with a bucket in each hand. Heard you were short-handed and figured a man doesn't turn away help just because he's too proud to ask for it. Wife'd have my hide if I let a neighbor go under without lifting a finger. I can't pay you for the day. Didn't ask to be paid. Prudence Hale didn't so much as look up from the fence rail she was already mending. Man doesn't get paid for helping bury his own kind of trouble either, and near enough every rancher out here's buried a version of what you're burying right now, one year or another. This is just what neighbors do, Mr. Marrow. Same as your daddy did for half this county back in the drought year, if the old stories are worth anything. Thad stood a moment, unable to find quite the right words for what was moving through him, something between gratitude and a faint, unfamiliar shame at how little he'd let himself expect from the people around him these past 3 years, having grown so used to carrying things alone, that an offered hand nearly felt, for a moment, like something to be suspicious of rather than simply accepted. "Obadiah," he said finally, to cover the pause. "Looks like we've got company." "Looks like it," Obadiah agreed, already handing Del Whitmore a second bucket, something almost like a smile working at the corner of his mouth. "Best not waste it standing around being grateful. Grateful doesn't drench a sick cow." They worked together till dusk. Nobody spoke much of Drummond or the bank or the survey flags out along the eastern line, though everybody there had heard some version of it by now, the way everybody in the county eventually heard everything. It simply sat there, unspoken, in the same quiet way Thad's grief had once sat unspoken among them for 3 years, understood, respected, and, on this particular Thursday, answered not with words, but with 4 extra sets of hands showing up unasked at first light. It was a small thing. Thad understood that even as it was happening. 1 day's labor against 40 head of sickness, and a bank note that didn't care one bit how many neighbors turned out to help. But it was also, he thought, riding back to the house, that evening with his muscles aching in the particular satisfied way of a day's hard work well spent, the first time, since Cora died, that he'd let himself feel plainly that he wasn't facing his troubles entirely alone, and that the town, which had spent 3 careful years respecting his solitude had, it turned out, been waiting the whole time for the moment he might need something more from them than silence. Addie came out to the ranch herself once that same week, a thing she'd never done before, in 8 months of Fridays, though she'd thought about it more than she'd ever admitted aloud. She borrowed Mrs. Kettleman's buggy on a Wednesday afternoon, telling herself the whole ride out that she was simply delivering supplies, a basket of bread and dried apples, and a jar of the broth she'd been making for him all winter, enough to see 2 working men through a few more hard days, and telling herself, less convincingly, that this had nothing at all to do with wanting to see, for herself, the place he came home to every night after riding away from her platform. The ranch sat exactly as she'd imagined it, and nothing at all like she'd imagined it, both at once. A solid, low house of good timber, weathered gray by 20 years of prairie weather. A barn beside it, sturdy, well-kept. Fences that ran arrow straight to the horizon in a way that spoke plainly of a family that had cared generation over generation about doing a thing properly rather than merely doing it. She didn't go inside. She told herself that was simple courtesy. A woman didn't go wandering into a widower's house uninvited, whatever the state of things between them, though some smaller, more honest part of her understood that she also wasn't ready yet, not quite, to stand inside the rooms Cora Marrow had once organized down to the last spoon. That felt like a threshold that ought to be crossed on purpose, when the time was right for it, not stumbled into on a Wednesday afternoon errand of bread and broth. Thad met her in the yard, hat in hand, startled in a way that made something in her chest go warm despite the cold. "Didn't expect you out this way." "Neither did I this morning." She handed him the basket. "Heard you'd had a hard week. Figured a man doing this much doctoring ought to eat something that isn't jerky and bad coffee." "My coffee's not bad. Your coffee is serviceable. There's a difference, and you know it because you've had mine." He almost smiled at that, the way he did, slow, climbing toward it. He set the basket down on the porch rail and looked at her a moment, something unguarded moving across his face in the plain daylight that she didn't often get to see out on the platform, where the light always seemed to catch him half in shadow, half in memory. "Obadiah's out with the herd," he said. "Wanted to ask you in for coffee myself, but I expect you'd only tell me mine's not fit to serve to guests." "I would." "Figured." They stood a moment in the cold yard instead, close enough that their breath mingled faintly white between them, and she found herself looking past his shoulder at the house. The window she guessed must be the kitchen, the bare garden fence along the south side, still and brown under the last of winter, and understood, standing there, that she was looking at the shape of an entire life she hadn't been part of yet. A life that had continued on, without her for 33 years, before she'd ever stepped off a train in Harrow Junction. A life she was only now, slowly, being let into the edges of. "It's a good house," she said finally. "It is." He followed her gaze toward it. Something complicated moving across his face, pride and grief, and something newer besides, all tangled together the way they'd been tangled in him for months now. "Someday I'd like to show you the rest of it. Properly. Not just the yard. I'd like that. Not today, though." "No," she agreed, understanding without needing him to explain it further. "Not today." She left before Obadiah returned, from the pasture, the empty buggy seat beside her feeling, on the ride back, considerably less empty than it had on the way out. And though she hadn't set one foot past the porch, she carried the shape of that house with her the rest of the week, the good timber, the arrow-straight fences, the bare garden waiting for spring, the way a person carries the outline of a room they've only glimpsed, through a doorway, already half in love, with what they haven't yet been shown. The count reached 40 by the end of the third week of February. Thad brought that number to the bench on Friday, and Addie saw it on him the moment he stepped through the door, saw it in the set of his shoulders, the new hollows under his eyes, the way his hand shook faintly around the ticket coins, before he steadied it. "How bad?" she said. Not a question. She'd learned that, from him, she realized, the flat statement standing in for a question too heavy to properly ask. 40 head, and the bank on top of it. "Tell me," he told her. All of it, Whitcomb's office, the 60 days, the eastern fence line, and its orange flags, buttercup under the bare cottonwood. And she listened the way she'd learned to listen to him, without interrupting, without rushing to fix what couldn't yet be fixed, letting the whole weight of it land in the space between them, before she said anything back at all. "You'll find a way through it," she said when he'd finished. "Will I? You've found a way through worse." "Have I?" 12 days, she said, quiet, deliberate. "You found a way through 12 days that I imagine were considerably worse than 60. He was silent a long moment, and something in his jaw eased, just slightly, the way it did whenever she managed to say the one true thing, that cut straight past everything easier, and less honest he might have wanted to hear instead. "Suppose I did," he said. "Then you'll manage this too." He looked at her, really looked, the way he'd once looked at every stranger stepping off every train. Except now, 5 months into whatever this had become, the searching in his face didn't come up empty anymore. Came up with her. "I'm starting to think," he said slowly, "that you might be the most stubborn woman I've ever met. I'll take that as a compliment." "Out here," he said, echoing, without quite meaning to, the exact shape of a thing he'd told her months before over a cup of coffee. "It is one." Drummond came to the ranch itself on the last Friday of February, which everyone in Harrow Junction understood, without a word being said about it, to be a deliberate cruelty, choosing the one day of the week Thad wasn't home, riding out to find Obadiah alone at the house instead, presenting himself at the door with a folder of papers and a smile that hadn't changed 1 degree of temperature since December. Obadiah did not invite him in. "Mr. Merrow's in town," Obadiah said, standing square in the doorway, filling as much of it as a broad man past 50 could manage. "You'll want to speak to him direct." "I'd rather speak to reasonable men wherever I find them," Drummond said, pleasant as ever, glancing past Obadiah's shoulder into the house with the frank, appraising look of a man doing sums in his head. "You've worked this land a long while, I understand. Longer than Mr. Merrow himself, in fact. A man in your position must have some notion of what's realistic and what isn't." "My position," Obadiah said, "is that I work for Mr. Merrow, not for you. A regrettable position to be in come 60 days' time, if things don't go the way I'm hoping they will." "Funny thing about hope," Obadiah said. "Rarely does much on its own. Man usually needs some kind of luck alongside it. And I'd say yours has been running thinner than you think, riding all this way out to talk to the hired help, because you couldn't manage the owner direct." Drummond's smile thinned, just slightly, the first real crack Obadiah had seen in it, since the man rode into town. 60 days moves quicker than most folks realize, Mr. Fitch. I'd hate for stubbornness to cost a good man his whole livelihood. Yours included." Man who's buried 2 marrows and a wife of his own besides, Obadiah said. Isn't much afraid of losing a livelihood. Losing this place would hurt, but it wouldn't be the worst thing I've survived standing on this porch, and I expect you know a good deal less about survival than you think you do, dressed the way you're dressed. That a threat, Mr. Fitch? That's an observation, Obadiah said. You can tell the difference by which one makes you nervous. He shut the door, gently, which everyone would later agree, made the gesture considerably more pointed than if he'd slammed it. That night, Thad came home late from town, weary in the particular way a man gets weary, when he spent an entire day doing arithmetic that refuses to come out in his favor no matter how many times he runs it. He found Obadiah at the kitchen table, a single lamp burning, a bottle of something amber, and mostly unopened sitting between them, that neither man had touched. He came by, Obadiah said, before Thad had even gotten his coat off, while you were in town, wanted to talk me into talking sense into you. And I shut the door on him, gently. Thad almost laughed. Almost. The sound that came out instead was closer to something tired trying to remember what laughing used to feel like. He sat. The two of them stayed quiet a while, the way they'd learned to over 3 years, letting silence do the first pass at whatever needed saying, before either of them committed to words. But Obadiah's hands, Thad noticed, weren't still tonight. They kept finding things to do, turning the unopened bottle a quarter turn, smoothing a crease in the tablecloth that didn't need smoothing, the restless motion of a man working up to something that had been sitting in him a long while. Something on your mind, Thad said. Not a question this time either. He'd caught the habit from Addie, or maybe he'd had it in him all along, and only just now noticed. Been on my mind 3 years, Obadiah said. Something in his voice made Thad go very still. I need to tell you something, Obadiah said, and I need you to let me finish it before you say anything back, because if you stop me partway through, I don't know, that I'll find my way to the rest of it. Thad nodded, slow, waited. Obadiah looked at his own hands a long moment, like they belonged to somebody else. Then he began. The night Cora took sick. His voice had gone rough, low, a voice Thad had never once heard him use in 3 years of working side by side. You were up at the Caldwell place, helping with their branding. Wasn't due back till the next afternoon. I remember. I was here, watching the house. Same as I did most nights you were away. He stopped, started again. She came down to the kitchen near dusk saying she felt poorly. Said it was nothing. Said she'd sleep it off. I believed her, because she always said things were nothing, that woman. Never once heard her complain in all the years I knew her. Not about anything, so when she said nothing, I took her at her word. The lamp flickered. Neither man moved to trim it. Middle of the night, I heard her coughing bad. Through the wall. Went and checked. Fever'd come on her fast. Too fast. Faster than I'd ever seen fever come on anybody. And I knew right then it wasn't nothing. Knew I needed the doctor. So I saddled up to ride for him myself. His hands had gone still now, flat on the table, like he needed something solid under them to keep talking. Creek was up. Storm 2 days before had swelled it past the ford, and I didn't know that till I was already halfway there in the dark, horse near going down under me trying to cross it. Had to backtrack, had to find the long way round, the bridge road, added better than 2 hours to the ride. 2 hours, Thad. 2 hours I spent fighting a creek that wouldn't let me through, while she lay in, that house getting worse, and there wasn't another soul on this earth who knew to go for help but me. Obadiah, let me finish. His voice cracked on it just slightly, the first crack Thad had ever heard in it. Got the doctor by first light. Brought him back soon as the horses could carry us. And he did everything a doctor could do from that morning on, 12 days of everything he knew how to try. But I've laid awake more nights than I can count wondering if 2 hours might have been the difference. If a creek not being up, or me knowing a faster way round it, might have meant this house never went quiet the way it did. I never told you because what good would it have done you, grieving already, to carry my failure on top of your own grief? but I've carried it myself every day since. Every single Friday you've ridden into town and sat on that bench, I've sat right here knowing part of the reason you're sitting there at all might trace straight back to a creek I couldn't cross fast enough. The house was silent a long moment. Just the lamp hissing faint. Just the wind finding its way through the old seams the way it always did in deep winter. Because Thad hadn't known. Because 3 years of shared suppers, shared silence, shared everything. And this whole time there'd been a second grief sitting right across the table, from his own, folded up small enough, that he'd never once seen the shape of it. Because that was the thing about grief he was starting to understand. It didn't announce itself. It just sat there, quiet in the room with you, waiting to see if anybody would ever think to ask what it was carrying. Thad sat with it, because there was nothing to say, yet that wouldn't come out too fast, too raw, before he'd had the chance to actually feel the whole weight of what he'd just been handed. Because a man doesn't absorb 3 years of another man's silent guilt in the space of a single breath. Because Obadiah had just done the hardest thing Thad had ever watched anyone do. Hand over a wound he'd been nursing alone for 3 years, not knowing if the man receiving it would forgive him, or never speak to him again. You rode into a flooded creek in the middle of the night, Thad said finally, slow, testing each word, before he let it go. Trying to save her. Wasn't fast enough. You didn't cause that fever, Obadiah. You didn't raise that creek. You rode into black water in the dark because my wife needed a doctor, and there was nobody else to go, and you nearly drowned trying, and you've spent 3 years punishing yourself for a storm that arrived 2 days before any of it and had nothing to do with you at all. Might have made the difference. 2 hours. Might have. Might not have. Thad's voice had gone rough now too. Both men's grief finally sitting plain on the same table between them instead of buried separate in 2 different silences. Doctor never said different. You never asked him because you were too busy convicting yourself before anybody else got the chance to. That's not honesty, Obadiah. That's just another kind of drowning. Just slower. Obadiah said nothing. His jaw worked once, twice, a man and used to being on the receiving end of comfort instead of dispensing it. I forgive you, Thad said, plain, no dressing on it at all, because some things needed saying exactly, that bear to land the way they were meant to. For whatever there is to forgive, which I don't believe is much. But mostly I need you to hear this part. You've been standing beside me every single day for 3 years, doing this ranch's work, and half of my own grieving besides, and you never once told me you were carrying this. That's the only part of tonight I'm angry about. Not the creek. That you let it sit on you alone this long. Obadiah's eyes had gone bright in the lamplight, and he looked away from it, out toward the dark window, the way a man looks away, from something he isn't ready to let another man see too plainly. Didn't seem my place, he said finally, to add my grief to yours. It was never a competition, Obadiah. Never should have been. We lost her together. Ought to have grieved her together too. Neither man spoke for a while after that. But something in the kitchen had shifted, the old, careful silence between them replaced by something rawer and, strangely, lighter, the way a wound aches worse the moment it's finally cleaned, before it starts, properly, to heal. We're going to need each other the next 60 days, Thad said eventually. More than we ever have. Reckon we are. Good, Thad said. Then let's start tonight. He reached across the table and, for the first time in 3 years of working side by side, poured them both a measure, from the bottle neither of them had touched, and they sat together while longer in the lamplight, 2 men who had each carried their own private ruin alone for 3 years, finally setting the weight of it down, where the other could help hold it. Sunday morning, 2 days after, Thad did something he hadn't done since the funeral itself. He rode to the small church cemetery on the north edge of town, and this time Obadiah rode with him, and the 2 of them stood together at Cora's grave in the thin March sun for the first time in 3 years, as anything other than a man alone. The headstone was simple, same as most out here, her name, her dates, a single line beneath, that Thad had chosen himself in the numb week after her death. She always ran the last 20 yards. He'd never explained the line to anyone who asked, and most people in town had stopped asking a long while back, assuming it to be some private grief too tender to disturb. Never came out here with you before, Obadiah said. 3 years. And I never once asked. Never asked you to. Should have offered anyway. You were offering plenty else, Thad said. Just didn't know it at the time. Neither did I. They stood while in silence, hats in hand, the wind moving soft, through the new spring grass just starting to green up around the older, browner growth. She'd have liked knowing you told me, Thad said eventually. About the creek. She always said the worst kind of loneliness wasn't being alone. It was standing next to somebody, and still carrying everything by yourself. Hated that particular kind more than any other. Sounds like a woman worth the 3 years you spent on that bench. She was. Thad looked at the stone a long moment. Still is, far as I'm concerned. Just differently now than she used to be. He didn't say more than that. Didn't need to. Obadiah understood well enough, standing beside him in the thin sun, that some kind of shift had happened in the man, over the winter, not a forgetting, nothing so simple or so unfaithful as that, but a slow widening of a chest that had spent 3 years closed tight around a single grief, making room, gradually, for something else to live alongside it without crowding it out. They rode back to the ranch together, and for the first time in longer than either of them could easily name, the quiet between them carried nothing left unspoken inside it at all. It was 2 nights later, unable to sleep, that Thad finally did the thing he'd been circling for 3 years, without quite letting himself approach it directly. He went up to the small room at the end of the hall, Cora's room, though it had been both of theirs, though he still thought of the closet in there, the trunk at the foot of the bed, as belonging entirely to her, the way a man leaves a garden untouched, not from inability to tend it, but from a conviction that its logic was sound and some things you keep because they work. The trunk had sat closed since the week after the funeral, when Mrs. Ashby from the church had helped him fold Cora's dresses away, with a gentleness he'd been too raw, at the time, to manage himself. He hadn't opened it since. Hadn't needed to. The kitchen still held her logic, the garden still held her hands in its soil every spring, and that had always felt like enough, like opening the trunk, disturbing what was folded, so carefully inside it, would be reaching for a piece of her, that wasn't his to reach for anymore. Except the bank letter sat downstairs on the kitchen table. Except the 60 days were already slipping away faster than he liked. Except somewhere in the back of his mind, in a place he couldn't quite explain, sat the stubborn conviction that his wife, quick with numbers, careful with paper, the daughter of a mother who'd owned property enough in this county to have opinions about how it ought to be used, might have left something behind worth finding. So he stopped circling, and he knelt at the trunk, and he opened it. The smell of her hit him first. Faint, after 3 years, but there, lavender water and clean cotton, a scent his memory had worn thin, without noticing until this exact moment brought it roaring back whole. He sat very still a long moment, letting it move through him before he let his hands go to work. Dresses first. The blue one she'd worn to the county fair the summer, before she took sick, still holding the faint shape of her shoulders in its careful folds. Because a dress doesn't forget a body that wore it even 3 years gone. Because grief has a way of hiding in the smallest, most ordinary places, not in the big things, not in the funeral or the grave, but in a sleeve still creased the way an arm once bent it. He set the dress aside carefully and kept going. Beneath the dresses, a small wooden box he recognized, Cora's writing box, where she'd kept letters and household accounts, and the small ephemera of a life she'd organized, as carefully as her kitchen shelves. He lifted the lid. Letters from her mother, dated across the years of her illness in Salina, the handwriting growing shakier toward the end. Pressed flower, indigo, gone the color of old paper. A single platform ticket, folded soft, not his, he realized with a jolt, but hers, kept from that very first Friday 9 years back, the day he'd carried her 2 heavy bags the 4 blocks to her aunt's house. She'd kept her own ticket too, all these years, tucked away where he'd never known to look. He sat with that particular discovery a long moment, because she'd never once mentioned it, because she'd carried her own version of the exact same faithfulness he'd carried his, quietly, privately, the whole 9 years of their marriage, and he'd never known, until this moment 3 years after losing her, that the ticket in his own coat pocket had had a twin all along, folded just as soft, kept just as close on her side of the bed the entire time. And beneath all of it, at the very bottom of the box, a folded document, older than the rest, its paper gone brittle and yellowed at the edges. He drew it out carefully and unfolded it by lamplight, and it took him a long moment of squinting at the formal, cramped legal hand to understand what he was looking at. A deed. Not for the ranch land, for a parcel closer to town, the very ground the depot itself now stood on. Signed, near as he could make out in the poor light, by Cora's mother's own hand, dated some 20 years back, long before Thad had ever known either of them. He didn't understand it fully. Not that night, exhausted and raw, as he was, his wife's lavender water still thick in his throat, and his eyes swimming faintly, with more than just tiredness. But he understood enough to know it mattered, enough to fold it carefully back along its old creases, and carry it downstairs, setting it beside the bank's letter on the kitchen table, two documents that suddenly seemed, in the small hours of that lamplit night, like they might be more connected to each other than any coincidence ought to allow. He would need someone who understood paper and law better than he did to make sense of the rest of it. He thought almost immediately of exactly who that might be. He brought the document to the station the next morning, well ahead of his usual Friday hour, a Tuesday, in fact, which was itself unusual enough that Addie looked up from the ledger with faint alarm the moment the bell over the door announced him. "Nothing's wrong," he said quickly, seeing her face. "Or nothing new, anyway. I found something. Wanted you to look at it if you've got the time." She had the time. She always had the time for him now, a fact neither of them commented on directly, though it sat plain enough between them. He laid the deed on the counter and she bent over it with the same careful attention she brought to every ledger and schedule and freight manifest that crossed her window, running one finger lightly along the cramped legal script, her lips moving faintly as she worked through the old-fashioned phrasing. "This is your wife's mother's hand?" "Believe so. Never met the woman myself. She passed before Cora, and I married. But I've seen her letters. Same hand." Addie read further, frowning now, the frown of someone assembling a puzzle, whose picture hadn't yet come clear. "It's a land grant, to the township. This parcel," she tapped the description. "This is the depot ground, Thad. This is where we're standing right now." "That's what I thought. Couldn't be certain reading it myself." "There's a condition attached." Her finger moved lower to a clause set apart from the rest in slightly smaller script, the kind of clause a careful woman includes precisely because she expects someone someday might try to overlook it. "The land is granted to the township in perpetuity for the specific and continued purpose of public rail access, provided that such access remains open and unobstructed to all persons of the township in perpetuity, or the grant reverts." She paused, working through the legal knot of it. "Reverts to the original grantor's heirs." Thad stood very still. "Heirs," he repeated. "Cora had no siblings," Addie said slowly, working it through even as she said it. "You told me that once. Which would make you her husband, her only heir." "Thad, I know. Thad, if this holds." "I know." They looked at each other across the counter a long moment, the full shape of it settling into the room between them like weather arriving. "If this land ever stopped serving that purpose," Addie said carefully, "if the depot closed, if public access was ever obstructed, it doesn't revert to the township. It doesn't revert to the railroad. It reverts to me." Neither of them said the rest of it aloud, not yet, not fully, that a spur line built to make the old depot obsolete, to close it, to clear the ground for whatever profitable use Drummond and men like him had planned, might be exactly the kind of obstruction this old, brittle document had been written to guard against. That a threat aimed at making the station disappear might, if this paper held up under a judge's eye, hand Thad more leverage than Drummond had ever imagined he was dealing with. "I don't know what it's worth," Thad admitted. "Don't know if it holds up after 20 years, or whether a court in this county would even look at it twice. Then we find out," Addie said simply, and there was something in the way she said "we" that neither of them examined too closely in the moment, though both of them heard it, and both of them let it stand. He looked at her a long moment after that. Long enough that she felt her own breath catch, waiting to see what he'd do with the look, because she knew that look, because she'd been watching him long enough now to know exactly what it meant. When the careful, considering stillness in his face gave way to something less careful. Because her heart had started going fast, before he'd even opened his mouth, which meant some part of her already knew what was coming, and had decided, apparently without consulting the rest of her, to panic about it slightly in advance. Addie, don't what? I haven't said anything yet. You've got a look on your face like you're about to. Maybe I am. Then don't. The word came out faster than she meant it to, sharper, which surprised her, as much as it seemed to surprise him. Not yet. Not with 60 days hanging over your head. Not with 40 head of cattle already in the ground, and a man like Drummond circling the way he is. That's not really an answer to whether I should say it. It's the only answer I've got right now. Addie. I mean it, Thad. I know you do. Doesn't mean I have to like it. She almost laughed, except the laugh caught somewhere behind the panic still sitting in her chest, and what came out instead was something smaller, breathless, half a word, that never quite finished forming. Because if he said it now, if he said the thing his whole face was already saying whether he opened his mouth or not, she didn't know what she'd do with it. Whether she'd say it back. Whether she even had the right to say it back. Sitting on a letter she hadn't told him about. A decision she hadn't made. A door standing half open behind her, that he didn't even know existed yet, so she talked faster instead. Because faster felt safer than silence. Because silence right now felt like exactly the kind of room a confession needed to fill it. Say it once things are settled, she said. Say it when it isn't tangled up with all the rest of it. I'd rather wait and know it's clean than hear it now and always wonder if you only said it because everything else felt like it was falling apart around you, and you needed one thing that wasn't. He studied her a moment, something working behind his eyes, not hurt, exactly, but close to it, the particular look of a man recalculating a distance he'd thought was shorter than it turned out to be. All right, he said finally. I'll wait. Thank you. Doesn't mean I've stopped thinking it. I wouldn't expect you to. He almost smiled, that same slow climb toward it she'd come to know so well, and for a moment, standing there with an old deed between them, and a bank's deadline ticking down somewhere behind both their chests. Neither of them said anything else at all because nothing else needed saying, not yet, not with so much of it already understood. Thad rode the deed to the county seat, within the week, to a careful, unhurried lawyer named Halloran, who read it twice, asked a great many questions about Cora's mother, and the original circumstances of the grant, and allowed, in the cautious language lawyer's favor, that the document appeared to have merit, though he would need time, weeks, likely, perhaps longer, to research whether a reversion clause 20 years old could still be enforced against a bank, and a railroad both determined to argue otherwise. I won't lie to you, Mr. Marrow, Halloran said, across a desk stacked with other men's troubles. This kind of thing can take months to settle proper, if it settles at all inside a courtroom. Your bank note doesn't much care about months. That's the gap I can't close for you, not with paper alone. Then what can you close? Doubt, Halloran said. Enough doubt in Mr. Drummond's own mind about whether this land is as clean and simple to take as he's assumed it to be. Doubt's a slower weapon than a deed, but it's often a sharper one, applied right. A man like that doesn't like uncertainty, doesn't like being made to wait on an outcome he can't control. You show him this document exists, properly filed, properly witnessed, and you watch how quick his 60 days starts feeling less like a deadline to him, and more like a gamble. Thad rode home, from the county seat, that afternoon with something he hadn't carried. Since December, not certainty, not yet, but the shape of a fight he finally understood how to wage. Word of the deed reached Cornelius Drummond by the end of that same week, the way most things eventually reached a man willing to pay county clerks for their conversation. And he did not take the news the way a lesser strategist might have, with panic or bluster or a hasty retreat. He took it the way he took most things, quietly, and then he went to work. He did not return to the ranch, or to the platform bench, or to Obadiah's closed door. Instead, over the following week, he made himself visible in town in a dozen small, deliberate ways, standing a round of drinks at the hotel bar for a table of local ranchers, complimenting Mrs. Abernathy's window display at the Mercantile, inquiring after the health of the Reverend's ailing mother back east, with a warmth that felt, to anyone who'd watched him operate before, considerably more calculated than kind. And in each of those small, pleasant conversations, he found some way to mention, gently, regretfully, as though the thought pained him personally, that the Marrow Ranch's troubles ran deeper than most folks realized. That a man chasing after 20-year-old paper in a county courthouse was, in his professional opinion, a man grasping at very thin straw indeed. That it would be a shame, a genuine shame, if good neighbors invested their sympathy, their labor, their goodwill, their Thursday mornings with buckets in both hands in a fight that had likely already been decided by men, with considerably more resources than sentiment could ever hope to match. Not saying the man doesn't deserve sympathy, he told Corwin, over that round of drinks, with an expression of perfect, practiced regret. Only saying sympathy doesn't pay a bank note, and a man ought to think carefully before he lets his own good nature get tangled up in another fellow's losing hand. It was subtle work. Nothing a person could point to directly and call unkind. But subtle work, applied patiently enough, has a way of finding the cracks in even a close-knit town's resolve, and by the second week of it, Thad began to notice, faintly at first, then less faintly, a certain new hesitation in some of the faces around him. Corwin's greeting at the feed store, a shade less hearty than it had been. A neighbor who'd promised extra hands for the spring branding season, suddenly vague about the date. Nothing spoken aloud. Nothing that could be called an insult. Just a slow, careful cooling, the kind that comes when doubt gets planted skillfully enough to grow roots before anyone notices the seed. Not everyone's roots took, though. Drummond made the mistake, one afternoon at the Mercantile, of trying the same quiet regret on Prudence Hale that had worked well enough on softer-natured men, and found, for his trouble, considerably less patience than he'd budgeted for. "Shame, really?" he said, standing near the counter, with his hat under his arm, watching her count out coins for a sack of flour. "A woman in your position, Mrs. Hale, running your own place on your own strength. Surely you understand better than most what it costs a person to gamble hours and goodwill on a fight that's already lost." Prudence Hale did not look up from her counting. "I understand plenty about gambling on lost fights, Mr. Drummond. Buried a husband doing exactly that, in a blizzard that most sensible men would have called unsurvivable before he ever rode out into it. Difference is, he wasn't gambling on land or money. He was gambling on a neighbor stuck out in it, who needed help getting home. Lost that particular gamble as it happens. But I've never once regretted that he made it." She finished counting, set the coins on the counter, and looked at him directly for the first time. "So you'll forgive me," she went on, "if I don't take financial advice from a man who's never once, far as this town can tell, gambled anything of his own on anybody but himself. I'll keep sending my hands out to the Marrow place whenever they're needed, sir, lost fight or not. Some things are worth losing if the alternative is winning by standing clear of them." She gathered her flour and walked out, and Mrs. Abernathy, who'd been pretending very hard not to listen, from behind the fabric counter the whole time, later confessed to Mrs. Kettleman that she'd never in her life wanted quite so badly to applaud a woman buying flour. The story reached Thad by Friday secondhand, the way all the best stories in Harrow Junction eventually did, and he found himself hearing it, laughing out loud for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that surprised him with how good it felt coming out. He mentioned it to Addie that same Friday, low, over coffee, more troubled by the wider campaign of doubt than the laugh let show. "Man's not fighting me anymore," he said. "Not directly. He's working the town instead. Working the doubt." "Is it working?" "Some. Not everywhere." He told her about Prudence Hale, and something in Addie's face softened, warm and fierce at once, hearing it. "That's this town," she said. "That's exactly what I meant. Some of it's cooling anyway. Corwin's gone quieter. The branding help's gone vague on its dates." "Some will cool," she agreed. "Doubt's patient work, same as your Fridays were." "But patient work cuts both ways, Thad. You've spent 3 years teaching this town what steadiness looks like, long before Drummond ever rode into it in his fine coat. I don't believe a few weeks of quiet talk undoes 3 years of that. Give people more credit than that. Give this town more credit than that. He looked at her a long moment, something easing in his chest despite the weight still sitting there. I'm trying to, he said. Try harder, she said, not unkindly. And there was enough warmth folded into the words that he found himself, despite everything, almost smiling. The letter from Ellsworth Junction arrived 11 days later on a Wednesday, tucked among the ordinary correspondence Addie sorted each morning. Before the depot opened, freight manifests, a seed catalog addressed to Mrs. Abernathy, a letter for the Reverend from a seminary friend back east, and beneath all of it, addressed to Miss A. Whitfield, in a formal clerk's hand she didn't recognize. She read it standing at the sorting table, and by the second paragraph her hands had gone very still. Ellsworth Junction, a depot 4 times the size of Harrow's on the main line proper, full station staff, salary better than what she made here by a considerable margin. A woman she'd known slightly in Topeka, it seemed, had recommended her for the position, had spoken of her exacting ledgers, her steady hand in terms generous enough that the Ellsworth stationmaster had written directly, requesting a reply within 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She set the letter down, picked it back up, read it a third time, as though a fourth reading might reveal it to be something other than what it plainly was. Because this was exactly the kind of opportunity she'd have leapt at 8 months ago, stepping off the train, from Topeka with 1 trunk and 1 hat box, and a heart folded up small enough to fit in a coat pocket. Better pay, bigger station, a fresh start somewhere nobody knew her name, which was, once, the only kind of start she'd believed herself capable of wanting. Except now there was a bench, and a man on it every Friday, who'd asked her to wait for the right moment to hear something she already half knew he wanted to say. Except there was a Tuesday morning spent bent over an old deed with him, her finger tracing the same line his eyes were tracing, both of them breathing the same held breath of possibility. Except there was a room at Mrs. Kettleman's that had stopped feeling temporary sometime in the last few months, without her quite noticing the exact day it happened. Except there was an entire town that had started saving her a seat, angling it just so toward a man who used to sit alone. She folded the letter along its creases carefully, the way you fold something you aren't ready to decide about yet, and tucked it into the bottom drawer of the ticket counter, beneath the spare ledgers where it would sit unanswered for longer than she meant it to. She told no one, not right away. Because telling Mrs. Kettleman would mean saying it out loud, and saying it out loud would mean deciding, and she wasn't ready yet to decide. Because telling Thad, with the bank's 60 days ticking down around him, with 40 head of cattle, and a brittle old deed that might save everything, or might mean nothing at all, felt, in that particular moment, like adding weight to a man already carrying more than his share. Because some kinds of news she was learning needed to sit inside a person a while before they could safely be let out into a room with somebody else in it. So she carried the letter folded in the bottom drawer, and she carried Thad's coffee out to the bench every Friday same as always, and if her hands shook faintly some mornings sorting the mail, wondering whether today would be the day she finally said something, nobody in Harrow Junction noticed it but her. Mrs. Kettleman noticed anyway. Because Mrs. Kettleman noticed most things. "You've gone quiet at supper," she observed one evening in the 3rd week of March, setting down the potatoes, with the same finality she brought to every observation she'd ever made at that table. "Not sad quiet, something on your mind quiet. I know the difference. I'm only tired. Mrs. Kettleman did not look convinced and did not pretend to be, though she let the matter rest a moment before trying again from a different angle. "Man ever say anything to you yet? Marrow, plain as I can put it." Addie felt her face warm, the way it always did lately at any direct mention of him. "He was about to. I asked him to wait." "Why in the world would you do a fool thing like that?" "Because there's too much sitting on him right now. The bank, the cattle. I didn't want it tangled up in all of that." Mrs. Kettleman studied her a long moment, spectacles catching the lamplight, and something in her face shifted, from teasing to something more careful. "That the whole reason?" she asked. "Or only the reason you're most comfortable saying out loud?" Addie didn't answer right away, which was, in its own way, an answer. "There's a letter?" she admitted finally, quiet, the words coming out smaller than she meant them to. A position, bigger station, better pay. I haven't decided anything yet. Haven't you? I haven't. Dear. Mrs. Kettleman set her mending down entirely now, giving Addie the whole of her attention in a way she rarely did. I've watched a great many young women pass through this town over the years, and I've learned to tell the difference between a woman who hasn't decided yet and a woman who's already decided and is only waiting to see if she can talk herself out of admitting it. Which one are you? Addie opened her mouth, closed it again. I don't know, she said finally, and it was, she realized even, as she said it, the most honest thing she'd managed to say about the letter to anyone, including herself. Well, Mrs. Kettleman picked her mending back up, unhurried, as though she hadn't just laid a hand directly on the exact thing Addie had been avoiding for 11 days straight. You'll know eventually. Everybody does, sooner or later, whether they want to or not. Just don't let later turn into an excuse to let the choosing happen by accident instead of on purpose. That's the only mistake I'd caution you against. The rest is yours to make however you see fit. A few nights after that, sorting through her own small trunk for a shawl against the cold, Addie found herself looking at the space where the letter sat hidden beneath the ledgers downstairs and thought with a clarity that startled her that she had crossed 100 miles of prairie to stop being the kind of woman who organized her whole life around other people's needs, and here she was quietly organizing her decision around not wanting to burden a man whose burdens weren't, strictly speaking, hers to carry at all. Except they felt like hers. That was the trouble. Because somewhere in 8 months of Fridays, without her ever formally agreeing to it, Thaddeus Merrow's troubles had become the kind of weight she wanted to help hold, not the kind she wanted to spare herself from by leaving quietly for a bigger station and a fresh start where nobody would ever have to know she'd once had a choice to make and made it in silence. And which was worse, really staying and risking everything on a man whose land might be gone within weeks, or leaving and knowing every single day for the rest of her life exactly what she'd walked away from. Because she'd walked away once already. From Topeka. From every soft, tender look anyone had ever offered her after her parents died. And she had told herself, riding west with one trunk and one hat box, that walking away was simply what capable women did when staying got too hard to bear. Except staying wasn't hard anymore. That was the part she couldn't quite make sense of. Staying lately was the easiest thing in her whole life. It was the leaving that had started to feel unbearable, and she didn't know what to do with a fear that had turned itself completely inside out sometime over the winter without asking her permission first. She sat with the shawl half folded in her lap along, while that evening, the lamp burning low, and did not reach a conclusion. Only understood with the same flat clarity that had carried her through both her parents' deaths, that a decision was coming whether she made it deliberately or simply let the 3 weeks run out and made it by default, and that either way the choosing was going to cost her something. It always did in her experience. The only real question left was what. The answer came to her in the end on a Tuesday in the final week of March, in the 10 minutes before the eastbound was due, standing alone at the ticket window with the letter from the bottom drawer finally spread flat in front of her. She told herself it was only prudence. Because a position like Ellsworth didn't come twice. Because a woman who'd built her whole adult life on capability owed it to that capability not to let it go soft over a bench and a cup of coffee, and a man who hadn't even finished saying the thing his face kept almost saying. Because 60 days was ticking down on his ranch, same as 3 weeks was ticking down on her letter, and what kind of foundation was that to build anything on, two people each standing on ground that might not hold, each too afraid to say so out loud. She wrote the reply in her own hand. Dear Sir, got that far and stopped. Except stopping wasn't deciding. Stopping was only delay wearing a more respectable coat. So she made herself keep going, the way she'd made herself keep going, through every hard thing, since January of her 22nd year, one line at a time, because that was the only method she'd ever fully trusted. I am writing to accept the position, she wrote. Her hand didn't shake writing it. That surprised her more than the decision itself. She thought of the bench once, briefly, while the ink dried, a flash of it, unbidden, Thad's shoulders easing the way they did whenever she said the plain true thing instead of the easy one. She pushed the image aside. Because thinking about the bench wasn't going to change the 60 days. Because thinking about the bench wasn't going to unsick 40 head of cattle, or uncall a banknote, or make Cornelius Drummond into a reasonable man. Because a station 4 times this size on the main line proper was a solid thing, a provable thing, a thing that didn't depend on an old deed holding up in a county courthouse, or a man's ranch surviving a fight he might well lose. Which was, she understood even, as she folded the letter along its creases, exactly the kind of reasoning a frightened woman reached for, when she needed her fear to sound like sense. She sealed it anyway, sat with it a long moment in her lap, told herself she could still change her mind, before the eastbound came, through to carry the mail sack east. She didn't change her mind. She crossed to the sack hanging by the door, dropped the letter in, before the doubt still circling behind her ribs could talk her out of it, and sat back down at the counter, with her hands folded tight in her lap, willing them to stop trembling. They didn't for a long while. She told no one that day, not even Mrs. Kettleman. Some decisions, she was learning, needed a little while to simply belong to the person who'd made them, before they could be handed out into a room for anyone else to hold, and this one, she suspected, was going to need longer than most. March brought a thaw, and with it, a fragile kind of hope that felt almost dangerous to trust. The cattle sickness slowed as the weather warmed, though not before the count reached 43 head lost. A wound the ranch would carry the rest of the year, Thad knew, but not, as it turned out, a fatal one. Obadiah worked the surviving herd back toward health, with a quiet, steady patience that Thad noticed, now, carried none of the old distance in it. The two of them talking more freely than they had in 3 years, the silence between them lighter, worked through rather than avoided. Halloran's doubt, it turned out, worked exactly as slow and exactly as sharp as he'd promised. Drummond was waiting for Thad at the station itself on the last Friday of March, seated, uninvited as ever, on the far end of the second bench, his fine coat traded for one slightly finer still, as though the man dressed a little better each time he came to deliver worse news. "Mr. Marrow." He didn't rise. "Understand you've been keeping busy. County seat, twice this month. Man of business myself, I make it a point to know who's spending time with lawyers." "That's so. It is." Drummond studied the tracks a moment, unhurried, the same performance of patience he always brought to the bench, as though he had all the time in creation, and simply chose, out of some private amusement, to spend a little of it here. "I'll admit, I was curious what you'd found worth a lawyer's fee. Man doesn't usually go digging, through old paper, unless he thinks he's found something." Thad said nothing, waited, the old habit serving him well, same as it always had. "Funny thing about old paper," Drummond went on, when the silence stretched past what he seemed to enjoy. "County seat's a small enough place. Clerks talk, especially to a man willing to pay for their conversation." He finally looked at Thad directly, and whatever polite warmth had lived in his face before was, for the first time, entirely absent from it. "I hear there's some question about the depot ground itself. Some old grant with conditions attached. I'd be careful, Mr. Marrow, building too much hope on a piece of paper 20 years gone yellow. Courts don't much favor sentiment over settled title in my experience. And settled title is a thing a man like myself has considerable resources to defend." "Then I expect we'll find out together," Thad said. "Which one of us the county judge favors more, sentiment or a bank that called an old note the same season it discovered a fresh interest in a dying man's land?" Something flickered across Drummond's face, not quite anger, but close kin to it, the look of a man unused to having his own patient cruelty handed back to him in the same even tone he'd delivered it in. "Not many days left on that note, Mr. Marrow. Whatever you think you've found in that courthouse, it won't settle in time to matter. Paper like that takes months, maybe years. Your cattle, your bank, your whole ranch, those don't run on a lawyer's calendar. They run on mine. Then I expect what's left of this month is going to be interesting for the both of us." Drummond rose, straightening his coat, with the same unhurried care he brought to everything, and for a moment, standing over the bench, he looked down at it, at the worn gray cedar, smooth, soft by 3 years of a grieving man's Fridays, and 8 months of a growing something else besides, with an expression Thad couldn't quite read. Calculation, certainly, but something else moving underneath it too, something that might, on a kinder man, have almost passed for respect. Your father's note, he said. Your wife's mother's paper, your own 3 years sitting right here waiting on a train. That was never going to bring anybody back. You Marrows do seem to have a talent for building your whole lives on things that ought to have expired a long while ago. He touched his hat, the gesture as smooth and empty as it had been in December. We'll see which one outlasts the other, Mr. Marrow. Good day. He walked off down the platform steps, and this time Thad watched him go the whole distance, all the way to where a hired buggy waited at the road, until the man was nothing more than a fine coat receding into the ordinary business of the town. Addie came out from the window once he'd gone, sitting down beside Thad, without a word, the way she always did now, the width of the bench closed to nothing between them. Not many days left, she said. Not many. That isn't very long. No, he agreed. It isn't. She looked at him a long moment, something fierce and steady moving behind her eyes, that he hadn't seen from her before, not the careful, watching stillness she usually carried, but something closer to resolve. Then we'd better make what's left of it count, she said. He looked at her, and for the first time, since Drummond's fine coat had disappeared around the bend of the road, something in his chest eased, not because the danger had lessened, but because he understood, sitting there beside her on a bench that had somehow become both of theirs, that whatever these last days demanded of him, he wasn't going to be facing a single one of them alone. The fragile hope of the deed, the raw new closeness with Obadiah, the ranch still standing, though bruised, and underneath all of it, growing steadier by the week, the particular warmth that had nothing to do with grief at all and everything to do with a woman who guessed correctly on the very first try exactly how he took his coffee. He didn't know, sitting there that afternoon, that Addie had mailed her reply to Ellsworth Junction 3 days before. He didn't know she'd told no one but Mrs. Kettleman, and told her only half of it. He only knew, dismounting at the post outside the depot, counting his coins the way he always did, that something in the shape of the last 2 months had shifted the ground beneath both of them, the ranch's fight, and her quiet, unspoken one, running on parallel tracks, that neither of them had, yet found the words to lay fully alongside each other. Which meant that whatever came next in Harrow Junction was still gathering itself somewhere just out of sight. Quietly for now, but not, either of them understood, without quite admitting it, for very much longer. April came to Harrow Junction the way it always came. Bluntly, after a winter that had meant every hard thing about it. The cottonwoods along the creek pushed out their first green, tentative and pale, and the fence lines that had stood bare and black all winter softened at their edges, with new growth nobody had asked for, and everybody was grateful to see anyway. The bank's 60 days had become 9 days. Thad had stopped saying the number out loud sometime in the last week, because saying it made it smaller somehow, more manageable, when the truth was the opposite. 9 days didn't feel small. 9 days felt like standing on a platform watching a train come in too fast to properly see. Everything about to arrive at once, whether he was ready for it or not. Halloran sent word on a Tuesday, and Thad rode to the county seat within the hour, Obadiah beside him the whole way, because that was simply how they did things now. It won't hold up in court, Halloran said, without preamble, the moment they were seated across from his cluttered desk. Not cleanly. 20 years is a long while for a reversion clause to sit untested, and a judge in this county's more likely to side with settled commerce than an old woman's careful wording, however well-intentioned it was. Thad's chest went tight. Then it's worthless. Didn't say worthless. Said it won't hold up cleanly. Halloran leaned back, unhurried, the same patient confidence he'd carried since March. But a lawsuit doesn't need to win to be worth something, Mr. Marrow. It needs to be expensive enough and public enough and slow enough that a man with Mr. Drummond's particular ambitions starts doing arithmetic of his own. He's got a spur line to build, investors watching, a bank to keep steady. He doesn't want his name tangled up for 2 years in a Kansas courtroom over a dead woman's land grant, no matter how thin our case might actually be. He wants this settled quiet and quick and profitable. That's his weakness. Not the law. His schedule. So what do we do with that? We file, Halloran said. Publicly and loud and this week. And then we let the whole county watch a bank try to explain why it's calling in an old family note the same season it discovered a fresh interest in a dead woman's town square. See how that story sits with folks around here whose grandfathers likely knew your father, and whose own notes sit at that same bank. They filed on Thursday. Word moved through Harrow Junction the way word always moved, through a place that size fast this time because a filed lawsuit against the county's newest banker was precisely the kind of news that didn't wait politely at the edges of conversation. By Friday morning, the story had reached every counter in town, and by Friday afternoon, it had reached, in its own particular way, Cornelius Drummond himself, standing in the doorway of the agricultural bank with a face that had, for the first time since December, lost some of its careful, patient warmth. What Drummond had not accounted for, in all his careful weeks of quiet doubt planting, was what a town does once the doubt finally breaks, and the plain truth of a matter stands out in the open, where everybody can see it clearly. Corwin was the first to arrive at the ranch that Friday morning, before Thad had even finished his coffee, 3 of his own hands riding behind him. Heard you filed, Corwin said, swinging down. Figured a lawsuit needs witnesses same as a herd needs hands. We're here to stand up in that courtroom and say what we know, if it comes to that your father held this county together through the worst drought most of us can remember, and that this depot's belonged to this town longer than that bankers owned a coat fine enough to hide his intentions in. By that afternoon, a dozen more had come by in one form or another, some with offers to testify, some simply to shake his hand, Prudence Hale arriving last, with a written statement already drafted in her own careful hand, detailing exactly what Drummond had said to her at the mercantile, dated and signed, ready for whatever use a lawyer might find for it. Didn't know if you'd want it, she said, handing it over. Man ought to have to answer, in writing, for the things he says out loud trying to talk good people into abandoning their neighbors. Thad stood in his own yard, that evening, a stack of testimonies, and pledged support taller than he'd ever expected to hold in his 2 hands, and felt something in his chest ease that had nothing to do with the lawsuit's odds in a courtroom and everything to do with finally understanding plainly that he had never once been facing any of it alone. Not the winter, not the grief before it, not even the 3 lonely years on that bench watching a town that had simply been waiting patiently for its moment to prove exactly how much it had noticed and cared all along. He found Thad at the station, same as always, sitting on the second bench, with Addie beside him, coffee steaming between them, and this time he did not sit down uninvited. You've made this considerably more complicated than it needed to be, Mr. Merrow. Funny, Thad said. I was about to say the same of you. A lawsuit helps nobody, slows the spur line, frightens investors, costs us both money, and time we could otherwise spend settling this like reasonable men. Then let's settle it, Thad said. Reasonably. You withdraw the note. I withdraw the suit. The depot stays same as it stood 20 years, same as my wife's mother meant it to. Drummond studied him a long moment, something calculating moving behind his eyes. Not defeat, not yet, but the particular recalculation of a man realizing the ground beneath a plan had shifted more than he'd accounted for. You'd give up 43 head of cattle, and a hard winter for a piece of paper you admit yourself might not hold up in court? I'd give up a good deal more than that, Thad said. For a piece of paper my wife's mother wrote with exactly this kind of man in mind. She knew what she was protecting 20 years back, better than either of us understood until a month ago, and I've got half this county standing behind that paper now, Mr. Drummond, whether it holds up clean in front of a judge or not. That's not nothing. I'd wager your investors would agree. Drummond said nothing for a long moment. The 4/12 whistle sounded, far off, rounding the bend toward town. I'll have my lawyers review the terms, he said finally, stiff, the closest thing to a concession the man seemed capable of offering. No promises, Mr. Merrow. Didn't ask for promises, Thad said. Just asked for reasonable. Drummond touched his hat, the old gesture, though it carried none of its former smoothness now, and walked off toward the road, and this time, For the first time since December, Thad watched him go, without any of the old dread sitting in his chest at all. The settlement came 3 days later, delivered by Whitcomb himself, walking out to the ranch in person to hand Thad the papers rather than trust them to the mail. "Notes withdrawn?" Whitcomb said, standing in the yard, with his hat in his hands, something like relief plain on his own face. "Full withdrawal, no conditions. Mr. Drummond's decided the spur line's better served running a mile further east, past your boundary entirely. Depot stays where it's always stood." Thad read the papers twice, the same way he'd read every hard letter, that winter, though this time the reading left something warm in his chest instead of dread. "Just like that," he said. "Just like that." Whitcomb allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Man like Drummond doesn't lose gracefully, Thad. But he does know how to cut losses when the arithmetic turns against him. Public lawsuit, a town standing solid behind you, a spur line that can just as easily run a mile the other direction, without half the trouble, wasn't much of a choice left once you look at it plain." Obadiah, standing beside the porch rail, let out a breath Thad hadn't realized the older man had been holding for weeks. "Ranch is ours," Obadiah said, quiet, testing the words like he wasn't quite ready to trust them yet. "Ranch is ours," Thad agreed, and for the first time in 4 months, standing in his own yard, with the papers in his hand, and the April sun warm on his shoulders, he let himself believe it entirely. He rode to the station that same afternoon, though it was only Tuesday, because some news couldn't wait for Friday, and because he had, finally, exactly the kind of clean, unencumbered moment he'd promised her he'd wait for. He'd stopped along the fence line on his way in, same as he always used to, before the winter's troubles had crowded the habit out of him, and gathered a fistful of the season's first wildflowers, loose, unarranged, the way he'd always carried them. Addie saw him coming, through the window, and knew, the moment she saw the flowers, that something had shifted. "It's Tuesday," she said when he came through the door. "It is. You never come on Tuesdays anymore. Not since the deed." Today felt like an exception worth making. He set the flowers on the counter between them, and she looked at them, and then at him, and something in her chest went very still and very warm at exactly the same time. "Drummond withdrew," he said. "Notes gone. Ranch is ours, clean. Whitcomb brought the papers himself this morning." "Thad," her voice caught just slightly. That's everything. That's everything you've been fighting for since December." "It is." He held her gaze steady, the old searching look finally, entirely, coming up with exactly what it had been looking for all along. "Which means I don't have to wait anymore. You asked me to say it clean once things were settled." "Things are settled, Addie." Her breath caught, because she knew, standing there, exactly what was coming. Because she'd known it was coming for months, in the careful, deliberate way he held himself, in the flowers laid loose on the counter like an offering only she could see the shape of. Except there was a letter sitting 3 weeks old in a stationmaster's office in Ellsworth Junction, an acceptance already sent, a date already set, and she hadn't found the courage yet to tell him any of it. "Thad, let me finish. You made me wait. I've earned the saying of it." She closed her mouth, nodded small, her heart going fast in a way that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with dread. "I don't know exactly when it started," he said. "Might have been the rain. Might have been the coffee or the 3rd cup or the Friday you sat beside me without asking permission first and just stayed. But somewhere in the last year you stopped being a comfort I leaned on because I was grieving and became something else entirely, a person I want standing beside me, not because I'm sad, but because my life is considerably better with you in it than without you. I love you, Addie. Plainly, cleanly, however you'll have it." The station was very quiet. Somewhere down the platform, a freight handler called out to another, ordinary noise from an ordinary afternoon, and Addie stood there, with the whole weight of what she hadn't told him pressing up against the back of her throat. "I love you too," she said, came out rough. "Honest. I have for longer than I've let myself admit." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, and for one long, suspended moment, standing in the April light, with wildflowers between them, everything was exactly as simple and as good as it should have been. Then she pulled her hand back, gently, and the simplicity broke. "There's something you don't know," she said. She told him everything. The letter, Ellsworth Junction. The 3 weeks, the acceptance mailed in secret in the 3rd week of March, the departure date now less than a week away. Thad stood very still, through all of it, the flowers still sitting on the counter between them, his face working, through something she couldn't fully read, not anger, not quite, but close enough to it, that she braced herself for the worst of it. "You accepted," he said finally, flat. "I did. And told no one. I told Mrs. Kettleman. Half of it. Half. I couldn't tell you the whole of it, Thad. Not with everything you were carrying. The bank, the cattle, Drummond. I told myself I was protecting you. From one more weight. I've since come to think I was protecting myself instead. From having to actually choose out loud in front of somebody who mattered." He was quiet a long moment, the muscle in his jaw working the way it did, when he was fighting to keep something steady, that wanted very badly not to be. "When do you leave?" "Saturday. The eastbound." 4 days. 4 days. He picked the flowers back up off the counter, carefully, like a man retrieving something he wasn't, yet certain still belonged to him, and looked at her a long moment, and there was nothing performed in his face now, nothing careful. Only the plain, unguarded hurt of a man who'd finally said the hardest true thing he knew, only to learn the ground he'd set it on had already been quietly sold out, from under him. "I said I loved you," he said. "You said it back. And in the same breath, you're telling me you're leaving Saturday. I didn't know how to tell you sooner. That's not an answer to whether you're still going." She didn't have an answer to that. Not yet. And the silence between them, standing there in the April light, with wildflowers wilting slightly in his hand, said more than either of them could have managed with words. He left without finishing his coffee. Left the flowers behind on the counter because neither of them in the moment could bring themselves to decide whose they were anymore. The 4 days that followed moved the way the worst days always move, too slow and too fast at once. Every hour stretched thin with things unsaid. He didn't come Wednesday, didn't come Thursday. Addie packed her trunk in the evenings at Mrs. Kettleman's, folding her few dresses the way she'd folded them leaving Topeka, and found the whole process considerably harder this time, though she couldn't have said, precisely, why a trunk should weigh more simply for having a happier year behind it. "You don't have to go," Mrs. Kettleman said on the last evening, watching her fold a shawl she'd bought new. That winter, back when winter had still felt like something to simply survive rather than something worth staying for. "I already accepted." "Accepting isn't the same as boarding a train, dear. Man says he loves you. You say it back. And you're telling me a letter sent in a moment of fright outweighs both those true things happening in the same room, out loud 3 days ago." "It isn't fright. It's practicality. Ellsworth is a real position, Mrs. Kettleman. A settled thing. What I have here," Addie's voice caught, "what I have here might be gone by Sunday, for all I know. He hasn't come. For days and he hasn't come. Man's proud and man's hurt, and man just watched a woman he loves tell him she's already halfway out the door," Mrs. Kettleman said, gentler now. "Give him room to be human about it, same as you're asking him to give you room about that letter. Doesn't mean either of you has stopped loving the other. Only means you're both, at the moment, too stubborn and too scared to say so twice in the same week." Addie said nothing, folded the last of her things, and that night, lying awake in the narrow room, that had stopped feeling temporary sometime, over the winter, she found she could not, for the life of her, locate the flaw in what Mrs. Kettleman had said. Only the fear underneath it, old and familiar, whispering that safety lay in the choice already made, however much the newer, truer part of her wanted to unmake it. 12 miles south, Thad was fighting a version of the same fear, dressed in different clothes. He didn't ride to the station Wednesday. Told himself the fence line needed checking, which was true enough, though it had needed checking considerably less urgently than his hands made it seem, swinging a mallet at posts that didn't need resetting nearly as often as he was resetting them. Obadiah watched him do it a second day running, before he finally said something. "Going to keep hammering fence posts that already stand straight?" Obadiah asked. "Or are you planning on riding into town at some point this week?" "She's leaving Saturday." Heard that part. Heard the part where you love her too and told her so, and she told you the same right back. Heard all of it, matter of fact, on account of you haven't stopped talking about it for 2 straight days, mostly to this fence. Thad set the mallet down, breathing hard, more from the words than the work. She kept it from me, Obadiah. Weeks. Sat across from me over coffee. Let me say I loved her, and never once mentioned there was a letter sitting in a drawer, with her name already signed to somebody else's station. And you kept a flooded creek, from me 3 years, near enough killed yourself crossing it. Obadiah said plain, no give in it at all. Difference between the two of you is she told you, before the train left. I never told you at all, would have carried it to my grave, if the guilt hadn't finally outgrown my pride. Seems to me you're in a poor position to hold a woman's fear against her, having forgiven a man his exact same kind for the exact same reason. Thad said nothing. The fence post stood straight in front of him, solid, needing nothing further from either of them. She's scared. Obadiah went on, quieter now. Same as you were scared 3 years on that bench, except her fear runs the opposite direction. Yours kept you sitting still, waiting on something that couldn't come back. Hers keeps her running toward things that can't ever really hurt her, because she's already halfway out the door before they get the chance. Doesn't make either kind of scared wrong, Thad. Just makes it human. So what do I do with that? Same thing she did for you, standing in the rain that first Friday. Show up anyway. Ask the plain question. Let her answer it herself out loud, where it counts. Obadiah picked the mallet up off the ground, held it out. Only difference is you've got till Saturday to work up the nerve, and you're currently spending that time murdering fence posts that never did you any harm. Thad took the mallet, didn't swing it again. For days, he said, mostly to himself. For days, Obadiah agreed. Man managed 3 years on a bench for considerably less reason than what's waiting on you now. Reckon you can manage 4 days. Addie worked her last shift Friday evening, closing out the ledger one final time by lamplight, running her finger down the long column of entries the way she had every evening for a year, freight tallies, passenger counts, and, near the bottom of nearly every page, the same familiar name recorded in her own neat hand. Marrow T. Platform admission. 5 cents. She sat with the ledger open along, while after the numbers balanced, not ready yet to close it. The new clerk, a quiet young man named Foster sent up from the county seat to take her place, arrived Saturday morning to walk through the schedule board and the backroom stove, and Addie found herself showing him the small particulars of a job she'd once learned from a man named Purvis in under an hour, moving slower than the task required, lingering over the coffee stove, the window with its view down the platform, the second bench visible through the glass. You'll want to keep the rag by the stove, she told him. Chalk dust gets into everything otherwise. Yes, ma'am. And the 412 runs late more often than the schedule admits. Don't let anyone tell you different. I'll remember that. She showed him the ledger last, the long column of Marrow entries near the bottom of nearly every page, and found she could not, in the moment, bring herself to explain what any of it meant, so she only said, "Mind the accounts, stay careful. Some things in this ledger matter more than the numbers say," and left it at that. And Foster, sensible enough not to press a departing clerk on a matter so plainly none of his business, only nodded and let it go. She stood on the platform a final time before her shift ended, looking down its worn length, the gray cedar siding, the water tower, the second bench sitting exactly where it had sat through every season she'd watched pass since February a year before, and felt the whole weight of what she was leaving settle into her chest, heavier now than any of the folded, careful reasoning she'd built up defending the decision to a room full of people who loved her. Then she went to fetch her trunk, because Saturday had arrived, and the eastbound didn't wait on anybody's second thoughts. Saturday came the way Fridays always used to, bluntly and then all at once. She was at the platform by 3:30, trunk beside her, ticket for the eastbound already purchased, standing in the exact spot she'd stood 100 Fridays before, except this time she was the one waiting for a train instead of watching someone else wait for one. The plan had been simple: close out her final shift, board the 2:40 freight connection quietly, before the crowds. Be gone, clean, before anyone had cause to make a scene of it. Except the 240 ran late that day, delayed somewhere back down the line, and by the time it finally rolled the last stretch into Harrow Junction, the platform clock read 3:51. 1 minute before 3:52, her heart was already going too fast. Because 1 minute was nothing. Because 1 minute used to be the whole width of her Friday, watching that door, waiting for it to open at exactly 3:52. Except today the door stayed shut, and the platform stayed empty, and the clock kept moving whether she wanted it to or not. So this was it, then. This was the whole of it, boiled down to 1 minute, and an empty door. Except, she heard the horse before she saw it. Because some sounds a person learns to recognize without trying, the particular rhythm of a specific set of hooves on a specific stretch of road, worn into memory, over the better part of a year. And she turned, trunk still in both hands, and saw Thaddeus Merrow riding in at a gallop far harder than any Friday had ever called for. Hat gone somewhere behind him on the road, coat flying open in the wind. He was late, not by much, but late 3:58 instead of 3:52, 6 minutes that shouldn't have mattered at all and mattered in that moment more than anything else in the world. He swung down before the horse had fully stopped, breathing hard, and stood there 10 feet from her, looking at the trunk in her hands, looking at the train pulling in behind her, a Baldwin engine, black smoke rolling back, over its cars, the same familiar smell of hot iron, and creosote filling the platform between them, and looking finally at her. Because this was the part neither of them had planned for. Because plans didn't survive contact with an actual platform, an actual trunk, an actual train hissing steam 6 feet away. Because she'd rehearsed a dozen versions of this exact moment lying awake the past 4 nights, and every single one of them had been calmer than this. Steadier. Except calm was nowhere in her now. Only her pulse, loud in her own ears, and the trunk handle biting into her palm, and a single thought looping over and over without ever quite finishing itself. He came, he actually came. You're late, she said. Came out smaller than she meant it to. Fence needed mending. On a Saturday, the one day it actually mattered. Fence didn't know that. He took a step closer. Neither did I this morning. Kept telling myself I'd let you go, if that's what you wanted. Kept telling myself all week. Except I couldn't finish the sentence without it turning into a lie, so I stopped trying to tell myself anything at all and just rode. You could have come sooner. Could have. Didn't. Why not? Because I was scared, Addie. Same as you. Because a man doesn't say the word love out loud after 3 years of silence, and then watch it get answered with a train ticket without needing a minute or 4 days to figure out which way was up again. So why come now? Because 4 days was long enough. Because a fence post doesn't need resetting twice, and I reset the same one 11 times this week trying to talk myself out of exactly this moment. He gestured at the platform, the trunk, the train, all of it, because staying home today would have meant I learned nothing at all from 3 years on that bench. And I didn't spend 3 years like that just to let the one thing worth showing up for leave without a fight. Thad. Let me say this part first. She stopped, because she owed him that much at least after everything. I spent 3 years on that bench, he said, waiting for a woman who couldn't come back. Knew she wasn't coming. Went anyway, because some part of me needed the waiting more than I needed the sense of it. He looked at the train behind her, steam venting, the conductor already calling something down the platform about final boarding. I don't want to spend the rest of my life doing that again. Waiting on a woman who could have stayed and didn't, because neither of us found the courage to say, so plainly enough, soon enough. I sent that letter because I was afraid, she said, fast now, the words finally breaking loose. Not of you, of this, of wanting something enough that losing it would actually break me the way losing my parents nearly did, the way I watched losing Cora nearly break you. I've spent my whole life protecting myself from that kind of wanting. And then I met a man on a bench who wanted something enough to keep showing up for it 3 years running, without any guarantee at all, and it terrified me more than anything ever has because I didn't know if I had that in me. Do you? I don't know. Addie. I don't know, Thad. That's the truth of it. I've never once in my life chosen the frightening thing over the safe one. Not once. The conductor's voice carried down the platform again. Final call. And somewhere behind her the great iron wheels shifted, readying. Thad closed the last of the distance between them, close enough now that she had to tilt her face up to hold his eyes. Then choose it now, he said, quiet, everything he had left riding on the plainness of it. Just this once. Not because it's safe, because it's true. The train's whistle sounded, long and low, the sound rolling out, over the platform, and off toward the hill, where the rails curved and disappeared. The same hill Addie had watched him look toward 100 Fridays running. The same bend where, for 3 years, an entire town had watched a man search for someone who wasn't coming back. She looked at the train, looked at the trunk in her own hands, looked finally at him, and she put the trunk down. The conductor looked at the trunk sitting alone on the platform boards, looked at Thad, looked at Addie, and something in his weathered face suggested he'd seen this particular scene enough times, on enough platforms, to know exactly what it meant, because he simply shrugged, called the last boarding one final time, and let the eastbound pull out without her. They stood together and watched it go, watched the smoke, watched the wheels catch and turn, watched the whole loud, hissing weight of it gather speed down the track, until it rounded the bend and disappeared, same as everything eventually disappeared past that hill, except this time neither of them was watching it leave, with grief in their chest. They were watching it leave with something considerably lighter. I chose it, Addie said, finally, into the quiet the train left behind. You did. Terrifying, she said. Every bit as terrifying as I thought it'd be. Get easier? Ask me again in 40 years. He almost laughed, a real one, unguarded, the kind she'd only heard from him a handful of times all year, and pulled her in, and for the first time in a year of Fridays on a Saturday nobody had planned for, Thaddeus Merrow kissed her on the second bench, in full view of the station master, the freight handler, and half of Harrow Junction going about its ordinary business up and down Main Street, none of whom, hearing about it later, expressed the slightest bit of surprise. Mrs. Kettleman was waiting on her own front porch when they walked up Main Street together an hour later, trunk left forgotten back at the depot, and she took one look at the two of them, Addie's hand tucked into the crook of Thad's arm, both of them wearing the particular loose, unguarded look of people who'd just set down something heavy, and didn't bother pretending she hadn't already guessed the whole of it. Well, she said, arms crossed, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. I suppose Ellsworth Junction will simply have to manage its ledgers, without you, Miss Whitfield. It will, Addie agreed. About time somebody in this town made a sensible decision, without my having to say it 3 separate times first. She came down off the porch, took Addie's face in both hands, the gesture unexpectedly gentle for a woman, who ran her household with the discipline of a small general. Coffee's never just coffee, dear. Told you that back in April, near enough a year ago now. Glad you finally believed me. You were right. I generally am. Mrs. Kettleman released her, turning her attention to Thad, with considerably less softness, and considerably more warning in her face. You'll treat her properly, Mr. Merrow, or you'll answer to me, ranch or no ranch, deed or no deed. Yes, ma'am. Good. Now go tell that foreman of yours, before he hears it second-hand at the mercantile, and feels slighted. Obadiah, as it happened, had already heard. Corwin had ridden past the depot not 20 minutes earlier, and carried the news south at a pace considerably faster than any errand required, and he was standing on the porch when Thad rode in that evening, arms crossed, trying and failing to keep his face arranged into anything resembling surprise. Heard you made a fool of yourself on the platform this afternoon, Obadiah said, galloping in, hat blown clean off, whole town watching. Heard right. And she put the trunk down. Something in the old man's weathered face cracked open, plain and unguarded, and he crossed the yard in 3 long strides and pulled Thad into the same rough embrace Thad had offered him weeks before over the matter of family and ranches and staying on. Your Cora would be glad of it, Obadiah said, gruff, into his shoulder. Whole reason she ran those last 20 yards every Friday, I'd wager. Wanted you to remember what it felt like, being run toward. Looks like you finally let yourself have it again. Looks like I did, Thad agreed, and neither man said anything further, because nothing further needed saying, standing together in the yard, while the last of the April light went soft and gold across land that, for the first time in longer than either of them could easily count, felt entirely, unquestionably secure. He took her to the ranch the following week, properly this time, the whole of it, not just the yard. He showed her the barn first, and the fields greening up fast now with spring, and then he led her up to the porch and through the front door into the house itself, and she stood a long moment just inside the threshold, taking in what she'd only imagined, from a distance before, the good solid timber, the clean simple lines of a home built by people who'd cared about doing a thing properly. He showed her the kitchen last. Cora had organized it, he explained, standing in the doorway and letting her look a particular logic to where everything sat, what lived near what, which shelf held, which necessity, built up over years of a woman running a household exactly the way she wanted it run. He hadn't changed any of it. Not from any inability to. From the plain understanding that the logic was sound and some things you kept because they worked. Addie stood in the doorway and looked at it a long while. You don't have to keep it exactly as she left it, she said finally, gentle, watching his face for whatever truth sat underneath it. Not on my account. If you'd rather I made this kitchen my own. I know I don't have to. He looked at the shelves, the careful arrangement of jars and tins, 3 years untouched. Truth is, I never changed it because changing it felt like erasing her, and I wasn't ready for that. But I don't think that's the only reason anymore. I think some of it's simply good sense. She knew this kitchen better than either of us ever will, and there's no shame in keeping what works. He looked at Addie directly. Move what you need to move, though. Whatever doesn't serve you, change it. This is your kitchen now, too. Both of you get a say in it, far as I'm concerned, the living and the gone. Addie felt something in her chest go warm and unsteady at once, hearing it put that way, not a replacement, not a haunting, but a kind of quiet partnership across the distance of death. The two women who'd shaped this man's life sharing a kitchen shelf, without either one needing to be erased for the other to matter. I think I'd like that, she said, learning it as it is first, changing only what needs changing when the time comes. That sounds like exactly the kind of good sense she'd have approved of. Then he took her out to the garden. Cora had planted it their first spring married, kitchen herbs along the south edge, something that flowered along the north wall, and in the center, coming up now in the April light, the things that came back on their own every year, because a careful woman had chosen, deliberately, to plant things that would keep returning long, after she herself was gone. Thad stood beside Addie at the garden's edge, and didn't say anything for a moment. She had good judgment, Addie said finally. About the garden. About most things. Addie looked at what was growing, green shoots pushing up, through last year's dead growth, patient, certain, exactly where they'd been planted to come back. She thought about tending something that had been started by somebody else. Not replacing it. Not overriding it. Understanding it well enough, instead, to carry it forward correctly. That was its own kind of love, she thought. A different kind than beginning something new. But not, in any way that mattered, a lesser one. I'd need to learn what she planted, Addie said, before I could help with any of it properly. I can tell you what I know, Thad said, which isn't all of it. Cora kept some of her own counsel, same as most gardeners do. That's all right, Addie said. We'll figure out the rest. They stood together in the April garden, the Kansas light warm, and gold on everything, and that, for that particular afternoon, was enough. The town took up the matter of the depot itself at a meeting the following Sunday, after church, in the kind of informal gathering that passed for civic business in a place the size of Harrow Junction. Everybody crowded into the churchyard, Reverend Ashby presiding more out of habit than any official authority, the whole business conducted with considerably more warmth than most towns managed for their formal council meetings. Before we start, Reverend Ashby said, raising a hand for quiet, I'll remind everyone this isn't officially a council meeting, since Harrow Junction hasn't got one, and I'm only standing up front, because somebody has to, and nobody else volunteered fast enough. You volunteered fastest, because you like the sound of your own gavel, Reverend, Mrs. Kettleman observed, and the churchyard laughed, warm and easy, the particular laughter of a town, that had earned, over a hard winter, the right to feel light-hearted again. "Seems to me," Corwin said, standing at the front of the loose crowd once the laughter settled, "that a depot this town's leaned on for 4 years, and a family that's given this county considerably more than it's ever asked back, ought to have some say in whether that station stands or falls, spur line or no spur line." There was a general murmur of agreement, warm, unanimous, the kind of sound a town makes when it already knows what it wants and is only waiting for someone to say it plainly enough to act on. "I move," Mrs. Kettleman said, with the finality of a woman who considered most motions a formality once she'd decided to make them, "that this town petition the railroad to preserve the Harrow Junction depot as a permanent stop on account of its historical value to the community and further." She looked pointedly toward the second bench, visible from where they stood, "that the bench itself be maintained exactly as it stands in perpetuity as a fixture of this town, same as the water tower or the church bell." "Second," Prudence Hale said, without waiting to be asked. It passed unanimously, and the railroad, when the petition eventually reached them weeks later, found little reason to argue with a request that cost them nothing and secured, in the bargain, the continued goodwill of an entire county's worth of shipping business. The depot stayed. The bench stayed, with it, gray cedar worn soft by years of weather and grief and, more recently, considerably gentler things. Obadiah heard the news standing at the edge of the churchyard crowd, and when Thad found him afterward, something in the old man's face had gone unusually soft. "Your Cora's mother would be glad of it," Obadiah said. "Whole reason she wrote that grant in the first place, I'd wager. Wanted this town to always have a place worth waiting in." "She got her wish," Thad said. "Seems so." Obadiah looked at him a long moment. "You know you don't need to keep me on. Now the ranch is settled clean. Man your age, married soon, building a life, wouldn't blame you for wanting the place to yourself." "Obadiah." Thad's voice went firm, unmistakable. "You buried my father. You raised half of what I know about this land. You rode into a flooded creek in the dark trying to save my wife, and you've stood beside me every single day since, carrying half my grief right along with your own. You're not hired help anymore if you ever really were. You're family, and family doesn't get let go just because the books balance clean." Obadiah's eyes went bright, and he looked away, the way he always did, when something landed too close to true to look at directly. "Well," he said finally, gruff, clearing his throat, "somebody's got to keep an eye on you too. Lord knows neither of you has the sense to run a ranch, and a marriage both, without a steady hand nearby." "Reckon that's true," Thad said, and pulled the old man into a rough embrace that neither of them 3 years earlier would have thought either capable of offering. They married in September on a Saturday because Friday belonged to the station, and neither of them wanted to change what Friday had always meant. The ceremony was simple, the reverend, the whole town crowded into the little church, Mrs. Kettleman in the third row, with the particular expression of a woman who had watched something develop over the better part of a year and found herself finally thoroughly satisfied with the result. Addie wore a dress the color of the Kansas sky in early autumn. Thad wore his best shirt, the same one he'd worn every Friday for 3 years running, the same one he'd worn soaked through in the rain the day a new ticket clerk first sat down beside him and asked him who he was waiting for. Addie noticed, said nothing about it. Some things, she understood by then, were simply what they were, and needed no comment to be honored properly. The 2 elderly sisters from Mrs. Kettleman's table sat near the back, matched as ever, and were heard afterward disagreeing gently about whether the bride had cried during the vows, or merely looked like she might, a debate that, so far as anyone could tell, was never fully resolved. Prudence Hale stood near the door the whole service, arms crossed, looking considerably more pleased than her stern posture let on. Corwin brought his whole family. Elkins, passing through on his circuit by pure coincidence of scheduling, declared it the finest wedding he'd witnessed in 11 years of riding trains through small Kansas towns, and nobody present felt much inclined to argue the point. Mrs. Kettleman rose at the small gathering afterward in the churchyard. Cider passed hand to hand in tin cups, and offered the only toast the day required. "I fed most of this town supper at one time or another," she said, "and I'll tell you plainly, I've never once watched a woman's walk change the way Addie's did, coming back from that station of a Friday evening. Took me exactly one look to know something worth watching had started. Took the two of them considerably longer to admit it themselves, but we'll forgive them that, on account of stubbornness clearly running strong in both directions. She raised her cup to showing up, however long it takes a person to work up the nerve. To showing up, the churchyard echoed, warm and ragged, and entirely sincere, and Thad, standing beside his new wife, with his own cup raised, found himself thinking that no toast in the whole of Kansas could have suited the day better. After the ceremony, they walked to the station, no particular reason, no train to meet, nobody expected. They walked there because it was where everything had started, and because some habits, built carefully enough over enough Fridays, simply become the shape a life takes, without either person needing to decide it consciously ever again. The platform sat quiet in the September afternoon. The timetable board read the next eastbound at 6:14. The second bench held nothing now, no flowers, no folded ticket, no woman waiting alone with a trunk. Just gray, worn cedar, smoothed soft by years of use, sitting exactly where it had always sat, exactly where the whole town had voted unanimously to let it keep sitting. Addie sat down on it. Thad sat beside her. They looked east, toward the bend in the rails, toward the hill, the same direction he'd looked every Friday for 3 long years, except now the looking held nothing but ordinary afternoon light, and the quiet, settled pleasure of two people, with nowhere particular they needed to be. She knew, Addie said finally. Knew what? That you'd show up, even without a guarantee. She told you that once, didn't she, that it was the most frightening thing about you? She did. I think she'd have liked knowing it turned out to be the thing that saved you in the end. Not just the grief, the showing up itself. Thad reached into his coat then, an old habit his hand still knew without asking, and drew out 2 tickets instead of one. His own, soft and pale at every crease, and beside it, folded just as careful, the twin he'd found at the bottom of Cora's writing box back in March. He held them both a long moment in the September light. I used to think I carried this alone, he said. 3 years, believing I was the only one who'd ever kept something like it. Turns out she was carrying the very same faithfulness the whole while, just quieter about it than I ever managed to be. He looked at Addie. Seems to me the both of you taught me the same lesson, in your own separate ways. That showing up and staying and choosing the frightening thing over the easy one, that's not really about the waiting at all. It's about who you're willing to keep coming back for. He folded both tickets away again, side by side in the same pocket, and Addie thought, that seemed exactly right. Not one grief crowding out another, not one love erasing what came before it, but 2 kinds of faithfulness sitting quietly together, the way the whole town had learned, over one long hard winter, that a heart could hold more than it ever expected to, and still have room left over. Thad looked at the tracks a long moment, something easy and unhurt moving across his face. I think she would have, he said. Addie put her hand over his on the worn cedar bench, and he turned his palm up to hold it properly, and the September light went slowly gold around them, the way it always did at that particular hour on that particular platform in the small Kansas town that had spent 3 careful years respecting one man's grief, and then, when the moment finally came, had opened its arms wide enough to hold what came after it too. The bench was theirs now, not instead of what it had been, in addition to it. And somewhere down the line, past the hill where the rails curved out of sight, the 6:14 sounded its whistle, right on schedule, carrying nobody either of them was waiting for, and needing, for the first time in a long while, to carry no one at all.